What if I told you that for over a century, the United States government has been quietly documenting its own war crimes? Senate committees heard testimony about torture becoming policy. Presidential administrations authorized deliberate bombing of civilians. The CIA experimented on American citizens without consent. Pentagon lawyers rewrote the definition of war crimes to legalize what was previously criminal. These aren't conspiracy theories. They're declassified documents, stamped and filed in archives most will never see. If you're ready, hit subscribe. Pour something warm. Dim the lights. We're walking through the archives of power tonight. When liberation became occupation, the machinery of acceptable violence began its quiet evolution. By February 1899, American forces occupied Manila after defeating Spanish colonial rule in the Philippines, and what followed was documented in Senate inquiry testimony that would be systematically buried in congressional archives for decades. General Jacob Smith received orders to transform the island of Samar into a howling wilderness following an ambush that killed 48 American soldiers, and his instructions, preserved in court-martial records, were precise: kill everyone over the age of 10. The subsequent campaign resulted in an estimated 200,000 Filipino civilian deaths, though War Department records would later dispute these figures, offering lower estimates that historians continue to debate. Smith's approach wasn't an aberration. It was doctrine dressed in the language of pacification. The Senate investigation that followed heard testimony from returning soldiers who described systematic burning of villages, forced relocations, and interrogation techniques that would later be classified as torture, with one sergeant describing the water cure in matter-of-fact terms during sworn testimony: forcing water down detainees' throats until their stomachs distended, then pressing on their abdomens to expel the liquid. The committee's final report acknowledged certain irregularities, but concluded that the overall conduct of the campaign fell within acceptable military necessity, and Smith received a reprimand and retired with full pension while the precedent remained in active doctrine. What made the Philippine campaign significant wasn't its brutality. Colonial warfare had always been brutal, but how it established bureaucratic frameworks for categorizing civilian deaths as military necessity, how it created legal language that would protect commanders while sacrificing subordinates, and how it demonstrated that detailed documentation of war crimes could coexist with institutional impunity. The War Department's official history, published in 1902, described the campaign as a successful counterinsurgency operation, and the word atrocity appeared nowhere in its 600 pages. The civilizing mission's casualties multiplied with bureaucratic efficiency. In March 1906, American forces under General Leonard Wood surrounded a volcanic crater on the island of Jolo where Moro fighters and their families had taken refuge, and the subsequent assault, later documented in War Department investigations as the First Battle of Dajo, resulted in the deaths of more than 600 people in what military reports classified as combat operations. Wood's official dispatch described eliminating hostiles who had refused to surrender, but what the dispatch didn't mention, and what subsequent investigations would reveal, was that roughly half of those killed were women and children who had accompanied the fighters into the crater. The War Department investigation, conducted quietly in the months following the battle, uncovered details that never appeared in public reports, with soldiers testifying about finding cooking utensils, children's clothing, and family shelters throughout the crater, and one lieutenant's sworn statement described the final assault as more of a massacre than a battle, noting that resistance had effectively ceased hours before the last positions were overrun. The investigating officer's report acknowledged these facts, but concluded that Wood had acted within his operational authority, and the mission's objectives, to demonstrate American military dominance and discourage further Moro resistance, had been achieved with the methods deemed regrettable but militarily justified given the circumstances. Mark Twain, reading newspaper accounts of Dajo, wrote a satirical essay suggesting that the American flag should have its white stripes painted black and its stars replaced with skull and crossbones, though the essay wasn't published during his lifetime. Wood received a commendation and continued his military career, eventually becoming Army Chief of Staff, and in official histories, Bud Dajo would be remembered as a difficult but necessary action in a challenging counterinsurgency campaign, with the pattern firmly set, detailed documentation of questionable actions, followed by investigations that acknowledge problems while protecting institutional interests, followed by career advancement for the officers involved. Sanitized language for scorched earth became standard practice in classified reports. Throughout 1901, General J. Franklin Bell implemented a comprehensive pacification strategy in Batangas Province that would later be studied at military academies as an early example of population-centric counterinsurgency. And the strategy involved relocating the entire civilian population into designated concentration zones, the term used in official orders, to separate them from insurgent fighters. Bell's directives, preserved in National Archives records, specified that any Filipino found outside these zones would be considered hostile and treated accordingly. And what followed was documented in military dispatches and later congressional inquiries. Systematic destruction of crops, livestock, and food stores to deny resources to insurgents. The mortality rate in Bell's concentration zones, calculated from military medical reports and missionary accounts, suggests that between 10 and 20,000 civilians died from disease and starvation during the 6-month campaign. And Bell's official reports framed these deaths as unfortunate, but unavoidable consequences of denying support to insurgent forces. His correspondence with superior officers, later declassified, reveals a clear understanding of the policy's human cost, and a calculated decision that such costs were acceptable to achieve strategic objectives, with the language he used being precise and bureaucratic: reconcentration, pacification, securing the population, while the reality was forced displacement and controlled starvation as instruments of military policy. The congressional inquiry that eventually examined Bell's campaign focused primarily on whether his methods violated the laws of war as they were understood at the time, with multiple witnesses testifying about conditions in the concentration zones, describing overcrowding, inadequate food, supplies, and disease outbreaks. Bell defended his actions by citing military necessity and noting that similar tactics had been employed by other nations in colonial conflicts, and the inquiry's final report concluded that while Bell's methods were harsh, they had been effective and did not constitute violations of applicable military law. He was promoted and later commanded the Department of the Philippines, and the precedent was established. Population control through forced displacement and resource denial could be implemented within the boundaries of military legality, provided the paperwork was properly filed.
Water cure becomes standard procedure, marked a turning point in documented interrogation practices. In November 1902, Major Edwin Glenn faced court-martial charges for ordering the torture of a Filipino priest suspected of collaborating with insurgents, and the court-martial transcript, preserved in Judge Advocate General records, includes detailed testimony about Glenn's use of the water cure, forcing water into the subject's mouth and nose until breathing became impossible, then applying pressure to the abdomen to expel the water, repeating the process until information was provided or the subject lost consciousness. What made Glenn's case unusual wasn't the practice. Multiple witnesses testified that water cure was widely used by American forces, but that someone had bothered to file charges. When the court-martial heard testimony from soldiers who had administered the water cure under Glenn's orders, from medical officers who had treated subjects afterward, and from Filipino witnesses who described their experiences, and Glenn's defense was straightforward. The practice was common, sanctioned by necessity, and effective for gathering intelligence, with his argument being that Filipino insurgents used similar methods and that warfare in the Philippines required adaptations of standard interrogation procedures. The prosecution focused on whether Glenn had exceeded his authority and violated articles of war prohibiting cruelty, and the testimony revealed a disconnect. What Glenn had ordered was horrifying when described in detail, yet it was also systematic and widespread. Glenn was convicted, fined, and received a reprimand. But the sentence was later suspended and he returned to duty. And more significantly, the court-martial established that while water cure was officially condemned as cruel and therefore prohibited, its use could be excused by military necessity in specific circumstances. The legal framework created by Glenn's case would echo through subsequent debates about interrogation methods. Official prohibition combined with circumstantial exception, detailed documentation of the prohibited practice, and minimal consequences for those who ordered it, with soldiers who administered water cure testifying that they believed they were following proper procedure, and officers who oversaw its use describing it as an unfortunate but necessary tool. In Senate testimony the following year, multiple officers acknowledged that water cure and similar coercive interrogation methods remained in use despite official prohibition, and the senators conducting the inquiry expressed concern but took no legislative action. With the military's position clear in private correspondence between War Department officials, such methods were regrettable, but given the nature of the conflict, understandable and occasionally necessary. The documentation would remain in archives available to future military planners studying counterinsurgency operations and interrogation techniques. And the practice continued while the condemnation remained official, with the disconnect between policy and practice becoming a feature rather than a bug of military legal frameworks. When civilians became acceptable losses, military theorists developed mathematical frameworks for justified destruction. In the early hours of March 10, 1945, General Curtis LeMay ordered a massive incendiary bombing raid on Tokyo that would be documented in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey as one of the most destructive single air attacks in military history, with 334 B-29 bombers dropping over 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs on residential neighborhoods, deliberately targeting wooden structures in densely populated areas. The raid created a firestorm that killed approximately 100,000 civilians in a single night, more than would die in the initial atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. And LeMay's operational reports framed the raid as targeting industrial capacity dispersed throughout residential areas, though internal assessments acknowledged that the primary effect was civilian destruction. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, concluded that the Tokyo raid and subsequent firebombing campaigns had contributed to Japan's surrender but at tremendous human cost. And the survey's classified sections, declassified decades later, reveal internal debates about whether targeting civilian populations constituted a war crime under international law. LeMay addressed these concerns directly in post-war interviews, stating that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal for his role in the strategic bombing campaign. And his acknowledgement wasn't guilt. It was recognition that legality often depends on victory. The raids continued throughout the spring of 1945, hitting dozens of Japanese cities with similar tactics and similar civilian death tolls. And what made the Tokyo raid significant for military doctrine was its demonstration that massive civilian casualties could be justified through bureaucratic language and strategic framing. For LeMay's reports didn't describe burning neighborhoods. They described destroying industrial targets in urban areas. And they didn't mention civilian deaths. They referred to collateral casualties and population displacement, with the language creating distance between action and consequence, allowing planners to discuss civilian destruction in abstract terms. This linguistic framework would become standard in subsequent conflicts. Precise technical language masking massive human costs. Strategic objectives defined broadly enough to encompass almost any target, and classification systems that kept the most troubling assessments away from public scrutiny. The legal and moral implications were debated within military and political circles, but rarely in public. Sure, with President Truman's advisors discussing whether firebombing campaigns violated the Hague Convention's prohibitions on attacking civilian populations, though these discussions remained classified, and the conclusion, reflected in continued operations, was that total war necessitated total target sets. LeMay received promotion and commendation, and the precedent was set. Civilian deaths on a massive scale could be categorized as militarily necessary, provided they served strategic objectives and were documented in properly calibrated language. The mathematics of obliteration reached new levels of bureaucratic precision in February 1945 during the bombing of Dresden. Between February 13th and 15th, British Royal Air Force Bomber Command and the United States 8th Air Force dropped nearly 4,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on Dresden, creating another firestorm that killed between 25,000 and 40,000 civilians. Exact figures remain disputed by historians, with some estimates reaching higher, and the bombing was documented in extensive operational reports from both air forces, revealing a carefully planned attack designed to overwhelm the city's defenses and emergency services through sequential waves of bombers. The first wave dropped high explosives to break open buildings. The second wave dropped incendiaries to start fires, and subsequent waves targeted rescue and firefighting efforts. And the operational justification, detailed in bomber command planning documents, cited Dresden's role as a transportation hub supporting German military operations on the Eastern Front. What internal assessments acknowledged, and what would only become public through declassification decades later, was that Dresden's military significance was secondary to the bombing's strategic purpose, demonstrating overwhelming air power to both German and Soviet leadership as the war neared its end, with the targeting committee's classified notes revealing discussions about the psychological and political impact of destroying a major German city, particularly one with limited air defenses and significant refugee populations. The attack would demonstrate Allied air supremacy and, some planners argued, provide the Soviets with evidence of Western military commitment, and the moral controversy that erupted after Dresden's destruction never translated into policy change. Churchill initially questioned whether area bombing of German cities had gone too far, but his concerns were expressed in private correspondence and quickly withdrawn, with the official position articulated in RAF and USAAF reports being that Dresden had been a legitimate military target and that civilian casualties, while regrettable, were proportional to strategic objectives. The debate about Dresden would continue for decades among historians, but within military circles, the lesson was different. Massive civilian casualties could generate public controversy, but also military success, and proper documentation could justify almost any level of destruction provided strategic framing was maintained. The legal framework supporting the Dresden raid rested on interpretations of military necessity that would influence targeting decisions in subsequent conflicts. If a city's transportation infrastructure supported enemy military operations, then the entire city became a legitimate target. And if civilian workers supported war industries, then civilian residential areas became legitimate targets, with the logic being expansive and bureaucratically flexible. Dresden's destruction, like Tokyo's, became a case study in how to document and justify massive civilian casualties through careful operational language and strategic framing. And no one was prosecuted, no policies were changed.
Sure, and the methods were studied for future application. Testing new weapons on cities represented a culmination of strategic bombing doctrine's evolution. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped a uranium-based atomic bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing approximately 70,000 people and destroying nearly 5 square miles of the city. And the attack had been planned by the Target Committee, a group of military and scientific advisors who had spent months selecting appropriate Japanese cities for atomic bombing. Committee documents, later declassified, reveal selection criteria that prioritized urban areas with concentrated populations, minimal previous bombing damage, to better measure the new weapon's effects and psychological impact on Japanese leadership, with Hiroshima chosen specifically because it was largely intact and would provide clear demonstration of atomic weapons' destructive capacity. President Truman's decision to authorize the atomic bombing has been documented in extensive detail through presidential papers, military correspondence, and post-war memoirs, and the official justification that atomic bombing would end the war quickly and save lives by avoiding a ground invasion of Japan became standard narrative in American historical accounts. Declassified records from the period complicate this narrative, showing that Japanese surrender negotiations were already underway through Soviet intermediaries, though disagreements about terms, particularly regarding the emperor's status, remained unresolved, and multiple senior military officials, including General Eisenhower and Admiral Leahy, expressed opposition to atomic bombing in private correspondence, arguing that Japan was already defeated and seeking surrender terms. The Target Committee's deliberations reveal that measuring the weapon's effects on an urban population was explicitly part of the decision-making process, with scientists wanting data on atomic weapons' impact on cities, military planners wanting demonstration of overwhelming force, and political leaders wanting to establish post-war strategic dominance, particularly regarding the Soviet Union. These factors combined to make the atomic bombing of a Japanese city not just militarily expedient, but scientifically and politically valuable. And the committee considered Kyoto as the primary target, because its cultural significance would maximize psychological impact, but Secretary of War Stimson removed it from the target list, with Hiroshima's selection as an alternate demonstrating that civilian deaths were not merely accepted, but were integral to the weapon's intended effect. The legal and moral framework established by Hiroshima's bombing would influence debates about nuclear weapons for decades, with the principle that weapons causing indiscriminate mass destruction could be justified by strategic necessity and potential lives saved becoming central to Cold War. Nuclear doctrine and no international tribunal questioned the bombing's legality. No military officials faced consequences for deliberately targeting a civilian population, and the documentation process established that proper authorization and strategic framing could justify unprecedented levels of civilian destruction. The precedent was absolute. If stakes were high enough, almost any level of force became militarily and legally acceptable.
The second demonstration nobody needed followed 3 days later. On August 9, 1945, the B-29 bomber Boxcar dropped a plutonium-based atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 people instantly and many thousands more from subsequent radiation effects and injuries. And the bombing occurred even as Japanese leadership was debating surrender terms following Hiroshima's destruction and the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan the previous day. Military logs and diplomatic cables from August 8th and 9th reveal that Japanese officials were actively discussing surrender, though internal disagreements about conditional versus unconditional surrender remained unresolved, and the decision to proceed with the second bombing was made amid this diplomatic uncertainty, with military officials arguing that additional demonstration of atomic capability would accelerate surrender. The operational circumstances of Nagasaki's bombing highlight the bureaucratic momentum that had built around atomic weapons use. The bombing was originally planned for August 11th, but was moved forward due to weather forecasts. The primary target was Kokura, but cloud cover forced the bomber to proceed to its secondary target, Nagasaki, and the city's urban center was partially obscured by clouds. But the bombardier released the weapon based on radar readings rather than visual confirmation, placing the bomb's impact point farther from the intended target zone than planned. These details, documented in mission reports, reveal that the second atomic bombing proceeded despite diplomatic developments that might have rendered it unnecessary and despite operational conditions that deviated from mission parameters. And the question of whether Nagasaki's bombing was militarily necessary would be debated by historians and military analysts for decades. What's not debatable is what the documentary record shows. Surrender negotiations were actively underway. Japan's military position was catastrophic, and Soviet entry into the Pacific War had fundamentally altered Japanese strategic calculations, with the decision to proceed with the second atomic bombing appearing, in retrospect, to have been driven more by demonstrating weapons capability and establishing nuclear precedent than by immediate military necessity. Yet the official narrative, established in presidential statements and military reports, maintained that Nagasaki's bombing was essential to achieving rapid Japanese surrender, and no one involved in the decision faced investigation or inquiry, with the atomic bombings treated as military successes and their massive civilian casualties justified by war's end and lives potentially saved. The precedent was complete. Weapons of mass destruction targeting civilian populations could be employed with minimal deliberation and maximum documentation. Their use justified through strategic framing and consequentialist logic, and the legal framework for acceptable force had expanded to include essentially unlimited destruction, provided proper authorization existed and strategic objectives could be articulated. The machinery of power had learned to calibrate its language precisely enough to justify almost anything. Chemical warfare on American soil began as a public health experiment that would remain classified for decades. During the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Army conducted Operation Sea Spray, releasing clouds of zinc-cadmium sulfide particles over San Francisco to test how effectively airborne substances could disperse across an urban population. With ships stationed offshore using spraying equipment to release the particles that drifted over city streets, residential neighborhoods, and business districts, while residents went about their daily lives completely unaware that they were participating in a military experiment. The operation's documentation, declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests decades later, reveals that planners knew the particles would be inhaled by hundreds of thousands of people, but assessed the health risks as acceptable for gathering valuable data on biological warfare defense capabilities, and the operation was justified internally as defensive research, understanding how biological weapons might spread through American cities to better prepare defenses against Soviet attacks. This framing appeared throughout classified reports and authorization documents, providing bureaucratic cover for releasing experimental substances over a major American city without informing local government or the public. And the particles weren't immediately lethal, which allowed planners to categorize the experiment as low risk, despite acknowledging that some particles would be inhaled and that long-term health effects were unknown. It's the kind of logic that works perfectly in classified memos, but collapses under ethical scrutiny. Exposing people to unknown risks without consent is acceptable if it serves national security objectives, and Operation Sea Spray was one of numerous similar tests conducted across the United States during the Cold War, documented in Army records that would eventually surface through declassification and investigative journalism. Similar experiments were conducted in Minneapolis, St. Louis, and Fort Wayne, among other cities, with each following the same pattern: classified authorization, public exposure without consent, and detailed documentation of dispersal patterns and exposure rates. And the Army's Chemical Corps justified these operations as necessary for developing defensive capabilities against biological warfare, and arguing that real-world urban testing was essential for valid data. What the documentation also reveals is that health monitoring of exposed populations was minimal, and long-term effects were never systematically studied. And decades later, when Operation Sea Spray became public, residents filed lawsuits seeking compensation for health problems they attributed to the experiments. These lawsuits revealed internal documents showing that military planners had acknowledged potential health risks but proceeded anyway, prioritizing intelligence gathering over public safety, and the legal outcomes were mixed. Some settlements were reached, but the government's position remained that the experiments were lawful under military authority and served legitimate national security purposes. The precedent held classified military operations could expose American civilians to experimental substances without consent, and proper authorization plus national security justification could shield officials from accountability. Radiation dosing without consent expanded the experimental framework to nuclear research. Throughout the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s, the Atomic Energy Commission and various government research institutions conducted experiments exposing approximately 4,000 American citizens to radioactive materials to study radiation's effects on human bodies. And these experiments, documented in AEC records and medical research papers that would later be investigated by presidential advisory committees, involved injecting patients with plutonium, feeding radioactive materials to disabled children, exposing prisoners' testicles to radiation, and deliberately contaminating hospital patients with radioactive tracers, often without informed consent and sometimes without any consent whatsoever. The experiments were framed as advancing medical knowledge and supporting nuclear weapons development, both justifications that carried significant weight in Cold War research institutions. And classified AEC documents reveal that researchers understood they were violating medical ethics, but assessed the research value as outweighing ethical concerns. In several documented cases, subjects were terminally ill patients who researchers believed would die before radiation effects became apparent, allowing for clean data collection. and in other cases, subjects were prisoners who were offered small payments or sentence reductions in exchange for participation, raising obvious questions about whether consent obtained under such conditions could be considered voluntary. The documentation is extensive and deeply disturbing. One experiment at Massachusetts Institute of Technology involved feeding radioactive oatmeal to disabled children at a state school to study calcium absorption, with parents told the children were joining a science club, but not informed about radiation exposure. And another series of experiments at University of Cincinnati involved subjecting cancer patients to whole-body radiation doses far higher than therapeutic levels to gather data for military planners concerned about battlefield radiation exposure. Patients were told they were receiving cancer treatment, but the research purpose and the experimental nature of the radiation doses were not disclosed, and the researchers' notes preserved in university archives might show they knew the doses might accelerate patients' deaths, but justified the experiments as serving important national security objectives. The full scope of human radiation experiments only became public in the 1990s, when President Clinton ordered a comprehensive investigation, with the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments reviewing thousands of documents and concluding that Cold War urgency had led researchers to abandon basic ethical standards, that informed consent was often absent, and that vulnerable populations, prisoners, poor patients, disabled children, racial minorities, had been deliberately targeted for experiments. The committee's report recommended apologies and compensation, both of which were eventually provided in limited form. But the fundamental precedent remained intact. Classified national security research could justify extraordinary violations of medical ethics and bodily autonomy, and proper bureaucratic authorization could delay accountability for decades. Biological weapons development disguised as defensive research continued throughout the Cold War at facilities like Fort Detrick in Maryland. During the 1960s, the Army's Chemical Corps conducted Project 112, a series of tests exposing military personnel to chemical and biological agents to evaluate defensive equipment and procedures, and the project's documentation, partially declassified after investigative reporting by veterans organizations, reveals that thousands of service members were exposed to nerve agents, mustard gas, and biological weapons, including anthrax and other pathogens, often without adequate protective equipment, and sometimes without being told what substances they were being exposed to. The tests were conducted at various locations, including ships at sea, remote islands, and military bases, with sailors stationed on ships used for testing told they were participating in routine training exercises, but not informed that their ships were being sprayed with chemical agents to test contamination and decontamination procedures. And soldiers at desert testing sites told they were evaluating protective equipment, but not informed about the specific agents being tested or the potential health consequences. The military's classification system ensured that even decades later, many veterans couldn't access their own medical records or documentation of their exposures, making it nearly impossible to prove service-connected health problems, and the long-term health consequences for Project 112 veterans are documented in Department of Veterans Affairs medical records and congressional testimony. Veterans reported unusual cancers, neurological problems, and chronic illnesses that began years after their service. But the VA's position, maintained for decades, was that without specific documentation of exposure, documentation that remained classified, claims couldn't be substantiated, creating a perfect bureaucratic circle, classify the evidence, deny claims due to lack of evidence, maintain classification. Congressional hearings in the early 2000s finally forced partial declassification, revealing that many veterans' health claims were legitimate and that the military had known about health risks but classified that knowledge, and the precedent established by Project 112 would influence how military experiments with dangerous substances were conducted and documented for decades. Comprehensive records for research purposes, a minimal records for participants' medical care, and classification preventing participants from understanding what they'd been exposed to. The pattern repeated across multiple programs with informed consent, treated as optional for military personnel, health monitoring minimal, and long-term accountability avoided through classification and bureaucratic opacity, and when challenged, the military's position remained consistent. All actions were authorized, conducted under proper authority, and justified by national security requirements.
Mind control through torture techniques represented perhaps the most disturbing application of Cold War experimental frameworks. From the 1950s through the early 1970s, the CIA's MKUltra program conducted experiments on unwitting subjects to develop interrogation and mind control techniques, and the program, directed by chemist Sidney Gottlieb and documented in CIA records that survived intentional. Destruction efforts involved administering LSD and other drugs to subjects without their knowledge, conducting psychological torture experiments, and testing techniques designed to break down subjects' will and personality. Test subjects included CIA employees, military personnel, prisoners, prostitutes, and mental patients. Basically anyone who could be accessed without informed consent and whose participation could be coerced or concealed. And the program's scope was extraordinary. 149 projects, conducted at 80 institutions including universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. Many projects were administered through front organizations to conceal CIA involvement, with academic researchers sometimes aware they were conducting classified research, while others believed they were engaged in legitimate medical or psychological studies. And the documentation reveals a systematic program to explore the boundaries of interrogation and control, justified through Cold War fears that Soviet and Chinese intelligence agencies had developed effective brainwashing techniques. If enemies had such capabilities, CIA officials reasoned, America needed them too. And in 1973, as congressional investigations began examining CIA domestic activities, Director Richard Helms ordered MKUltra records destroyed. The order was carried out systematically, with most operational files being shredded or incinerated, and what survived, discovered accidentally in 1977 when financial records were found misfiled during a Freedom of Information Act search, provides glimpses of the program's scope but leaves many questions permanently unanswered. The surviving documents show that experimenters knew they were causing severe psychological trauma, that some subjects suffered permanent mental damage, and that at least one subject, Frank Olson, a CIA employee who was drugged without his knowledge, died under suspicious circumstances shortly after. Being administered LSD and congressional hearings in 1977 forced some public accountability, but the destroyed records ensured that full accountability remained impossible. Sidney Gottlieb testified but claimed limited memory of program details. CIA officials acknowledged the program had violated ethical standards, but argued it had been discontinued years earlier, and no one was prosecuted, with compensation eventually provided to some victims whose participation could be documented, though the destruction of records ensured most victims would never know they had been subjects. The precedent was complete. Even when illegal programs were exposed, destruction of evidence could prevent meaningful accountability, and institutional positions that mistakes were made but policies have changed, could substitute for prosecution, and the MKUltra revelations led to reforms in how intelligence agencies conducted domestic operations and handled human subjects. But the fundamental framework remained intact. Classified programs could violate laws and ethics if justified by national security concerns. Documentation could be destroyed if exposure became likely. And institutional survival could be prioritized over individual accountability, with the techniques developed through MKUltra psychological. Torture, stress positions, sensory deprivation, and exploitation of phobias, reappearing decades later in CIA interrogation programs during the War on Terror, demonstrating that lessons learned could be institutional knowledge even when official records were destroyed. The machinery had learned not just how to experiment on humans, but how to do it with bureaucratic efficiency and legal insulation. When we trained the death squads, American military doctrine exported its experimental frameworks to Allied forces operating under plausible deniability. Throughout the 1980s, the U.S. Army's School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, trained thousands of Latin American military officers in counterinsurgency techniques, and among the graduates were members of El Salvador's military units, who would later be implicated in systematic human rights violations documented by the United Nations Truth Commission. The training manuals used at the school, declassified in 1996 after pressure from human rights organizations, included sections on interrogation techniques, psychological warfare, and neutralization of opposition forces. Language that subsequent investigations revealed was code for torture and assassination. In El Salvador, American-trained officers commanded units responsible for massacres at El Mozote, where over 800 civilians were killed. And the Commission's final report documented 75,000 deaths during the Civil War, with the majority attributed to government forces and Allied death squads. The U.S. government's position, maintained throughout the conflict and in subsequent congressional testimony, was that training focused on professional military conduct and that any abuses were aberrations by individual actors, not systemic failures of American policy. However, declassified State Department cables reveal that American officials were aware of death squad activities, that some officers trained at the School of the Americas were directly implicated in atrocities, and that military aid continued despite this knowledge, because El Salvador was considered strategically vital in containing communist influence in Central America. The documentation shows a clear pattern. American training and equipment flowed to forces committing documented atrocities. Official reports minimized or disputed evidence of abuses, and strategic considerations consistently outweighed human rights concerns. Congressional hearings in the 1990s examined the School of the Americas curriculum and its graduates' records, leading to the school's rebranding but not its closure. While the fundamental precedent remained, proxy forces could be trained and equipped with knowledge that some would use American methods for systematic violence, and plausible deniability could be maintained through bureaucratic distance between training and implementation. The machinery had learned to export its techniques while documenting its formal disapproval. Supporting genocide for strategic position demonstrated how thoroughly Cold War logic could override humanitarian concerns. Between 1975 and 1979, Indonesian forces invaded and occupied East Timor, launching a campaign that would result in approximately 200,000 Timorese deaths, roughly 1/3 of the territory's population. And throughout this period, the United States provided military equipment and diplomatic support to Indonesia. Despite clear evidence of massive civilian casualties,
The invasion began in December 1975, one day after President Ford and Secretary of State Kissinger met with Indonesian President Suharto in Jakarta, and declassified meeting transcripts reveal that American officials understood Indonesia's intentions and discussed how U.S. a military equipment might be used in the invasion. Kissinger's response, documented in State Department cables, was essentially to proceed, but to wait until Ford and Kissinger had left Indonesian airspace to maintain plausible deniability. The strategic calculation was straightforward. Indonesia was a crucial anti-communist ally in Southeast Asia. Suharto's regime was considered stable and pro-Western, and East Timor's independence movement had leftist elements that concerned American policymakers. These factors combined to make Indonesian control of East Timor, regardless of the methods used, preferable to the alternative from Washington's perspective. And as evidence of atrocities mounted through missionary reports, leaked intelligence assessments, and testimony from refugees, the U.S., in response, was to continue military aid while publicly minimizing the scope of civilian casualties. Congressional legislation restricting military assistance to countries engaged in gross human rights violations was circumvented through bureaucratic mechanisms. Equipment was relabeled as non-military aid, or deliveries were timed to avoid reporting requirements, or the State Department's human rights assessments downplayed evidence to maintain aid eligibility. Internal State Department memos, later declassified, show that officials were fully aware these assessments were misleading, but considered them necessary to preserve strategic relationships. The United Nations repeatedly condemned the Indonesian occupation and documented the scale of civilian deaths, but the United States used its Security Council position to block stronger international action. And it wasn't until the late 1990s, after Suharto's fall and changing strategic circumstances, that American policy shifted to support Timorese independence. By then, the death toll had reached catastrophic levels, and the documentation was clear. American officials had knowingly supported a campaign resulting in genocidal levels of civilian deaths because strategic interests outweighed humanitarian concerns, and proper bureaucratic procedures had been followed throughout. No American officials faced consequences. The equipment deliveries were all properly authorized, and the precedent was set. Genocide could be supported through plausible deniability and bureaucratic maneuvering, provided strategic justifications were maintained and documentation carefully managed. The Phoenix program's quotas turned assassination into bureaucratic routine. Between 1968 and 1972 in Vietnam, the CIA's Phoenix program operated with a simple premise: identify and neutralize Viet Cong infrastructure through targeted operations that the program's own documents, later declassified, reveal resulted in over 20,000 documented deaths. William Colby, who directed the program before becoming CIA director, defended it in congressional testimony as a necessary counterinsurgency measure targeting legitimate military opponents, but the program's operational reality, documented in CIA cables and military reports, showed systematic problems with target identification, reliance on unreliable intelligence, and pressure to meet monthly quotas for neutralizations, a term that encompassed capture, a defection, or death, with death being the most frequently reported outcome. The program operated through provincial reconnaissance units that combined American advisors with South Vietnamese forces, And the declassified operational records reveal that interrogation centers operated with minimal oversight, that substantial numbers of those killed were later determined to be civilians with no Viet Cong connections, and that quota systems incentivized indiscriminate targeting to meet statistical goals. Reports from American advisors in the field, preserved in military archives, describe pressure to produce results measured in body counts and neutralization statistics, with limited verification of whether targets were actually Viet Cong infrastructure or simply civilians caught in intelligence nets built on paid informants with personal vendettas and unreliable information. Colby's congressional testimony in 1971 acknowledged that some innocents had been killed, but maintained that the program overall was effective and necessary, and his position exemplified the program's core logic. Civilian casualties were regrettable but acceptable if the program disrupted enemy operations, and statistical success could be documented through neutralization figures, even if those figures included substantial numbers of misidentified targets. The Phoenix program became a case study in how assassination could be systematized and bureaucratized. Targets were selected through committee review. Operations were documented in detailed reports, and outcomes were measured through quantifiable metrics, all creating an institutional framework that made political killing appear like routine administrative procedure. Congressional investigations revealed the program's problems, but resulted in no prosecutions, and the techniques and organizational structures developed through Phoenix would reappear in subsequent conflicts, demonstrating that institutional knowledge persisted even when specific programs were discontinued. The documentation was comprehensive, the abuses were documented, and the system protected itself through claims that individual excesses didn't invalidate the program's strategic validity.
Contra supply, despite congressional ban, showed how thoroughly national security bureaucracies could circumvent democratic oversight. Throughout the 1980s, the Reagan administration continued supporting Nicaraguan Contra forces fighting the Sandinista government, despite explicit congressional prohibition through the Boland Amendments, which barred using appropriated funds to overthrow Nicaragua's government, and the resulting Iran-Contra scandal, investigated through congressional hearings and independent counsel prosecutions, revealed systematic efforts to maintain Contra operations through alternative funding mechanisms and covert operations. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, operating from the National Security Council, coordinated a network that diverted funds from secret arms sales to Iran, solicited donations from foreign governments and private donors, and maintained Contra supply operations that congressional testimony and documentary evidence showed included not just military support, but also infrastructure that facilitated drug trafficking by some Contra units. The congressional hearings in 1987 produced extensive documentation of how the scheme operated. Arms were sold to Iran at inflated prices with profits deposited in Swiss bank accounts controlled by North and others. These funds then purchased weapons and supplies for Contras. And elaborate efforts were made to conceal operations from Congress and even from other parts of the executive branch. North's testimony, granted immunity, revealed that senior officials, including National Security Advisor John Poindexter, were directly involved, and subsequent investigations suggested President Reagan had knowledge of at least some aspects, though the extent of his involvement remained disputed. What wasn't disputed was the systematic circumvention of law. The Boland Amendments were clear. The administration's actions directly violated their restrictions, and elaborate mechanisms were constructed to maintain operations while maintaining deniability. The documented consequences of Contra operations included widespread civilian casualties, destruction of infrastructure including schools and health clinics, and patterns of human rights abuses documented by international organizations, and CIA reports, later declassified, showed that agency. Officials were aware of these abuses but continued support because strategic objectives, opposing the Sandinista government, took priority over both legal restrictions and humanitarian concerns. The Iran-Contra scandal resulted in several convictions, most of which were later overturned on technical grounds or pardoned by President George H.W. Bush, and the fundamental precedent held, even when covert operations clearly violated law, even when evidence was extensive and public. Consequences for senior officials could be avoided through immunity deals, pardons, and claims that national security justified extra-legal action. The machinery had learned that democratic oversight could be circumvented through creativity, and that accountability could be managed through the strategic deployment of pardons and immunity. Secret bombing of neutral territory began with presidential authorization and systematic concealment. Between March 1969 and May 1970, the United States conducted Operation Menu, secretly bombing Cambodia with over 150,000 tons of ordnance, despite Cambodia's official neutrality. A campaign documented in military records that were falsified to conceal the operations from Congress and the American public. President Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger authorized the bombing to target North Vietnamese sanctuaries and supply routes along the Cambodian border, but the operation's scope, revealed through subsequent investigations and declassified documents, extended far beyond border regions into Cambodia's interior, hitting areas with significant civilian populations. The falsified reporting system was elaborate and systematic. Pilots received briefing coordinates for targets in South Vietnam, but after takeoff they received different coordinates directing them to Cambodian targets. And upon return they filed reports listing the original South Vietnamese coordinates rather than their actual targets, creating an entirely fictional documentary record. This dual reporting system, detailed in Air Force records that eventually surfaced, meant that bombs dropped on Cambodia were officially recorded as South Vietnamese operations, concealing not just from Congress, but from much of the military chain of command the true scope and location of bombing. Operations. The operational justification, preserved in Nixon-Kissinger tape recordings declassified decades later, centered on military necessity. North Vietnamese forces were using Cambodian territory for sanctuary and supply routes. But the tapes also revealed discussions about the bombing's psychological and political purposes, including demonstrating American willingness to expand the war and pressuring North Vietnamese negotiators. Kissinger's position, documented in meeting notes and recorded conversations, was that Cambodia's neutrality was meaningless if North Vietnamese forces operated there, effectively arguing that neutral territory became legitimate targets once enemies used it, regardless of international law. The bombing's civilian toll remains disputed. Estimates range from tens of thousands to over 100,000 deaths. But what's not disputed is that extensive bombing occurred in a neutral country without congressional authorization or public knowledge, that military records were systematically falsified to conceal operations, and that no officials faced consequences when the deception was eventually exposed. The precedent was absolute. Secret wars could be conducted against neutral nations, reporting systems could be falsified to maintain secrecy, and claims of military necessity could justify both the operations and the deception, with proper documentation of fictional targets providing bureaucratic cover for actual operations elsewhere. Targeting dikes to flood farmland demonstrated how agricultural infrastructure could be weaponized. During 1972's Operation Linebacker in North Vietnam, American bombing campaigns included strikes on irrigation dikes that controlled water flow for rice cultivation in the Red River Delta. And, while official Pentagon statements denied deliberately targeting agricultural infrastructure, leaked Pentagon papers and subsequent investigative reporting revealed internal discussions about using dike destruction to create food shortages and civilian displacement. The dike systems in North Vietnam were extensive and essential. They controlled flooding and enabled agriculture that fed millions. And military planners, according to declassified planning documents, understood that destroying these systems would have catastrophic effects on civilian populations. The strikes were framed in operational reports as targeting military logistics near dikes or as collateral damage from nearby military targets. But the patterns of damage, documented by international observers and investigative journalists, suggested systematic targeting designed to maximize. Agricultural disruption. The leaked Pentagon papers revealed that the Johnson administration had considered dike targeting in earlier phases of the war, but avoided it due to concerns about international condemnation, with the papers showing internal debates about whether the strategic benefit of disrupting agriculture justified the humanitarian consequences and diplomatic costs. By 1972, under Nixon's intensification of the bombing campaign, these restraints were relaxed, and while official statements continued to deny deliberate targeting, the operational reality documented in pilot debriefings and bomb damage assessments showed repeated strikes on dike, systems that controlled water flow for agricultural regions. International humanitarian organizations condemned the strikes and documented flooding that destroyed crops and displaced populations, but the American response, articulated in Pentagon briefings, maintained that any dike damage was incidental to legitimate military targeting, and that North Vietnamese military installations near dikes made such damage inevitable. The legal framework was familiar. Agricultural infrastructure near military targets could be struck. Any resulting humanitarian crisis was an unfortunate but acceptable consequence of military operations, and claims that strikes were deliberately targeting agricultural systems could be denied. Based on the official targeting criteria documented in operation orders, even if the practical effect was systematic agricultural destruction, the precedent carried forward. Civilian food systems could be weaponized through strikes that were documented as targeting military infrastructure. Humanitarian consequences could be dismissed as collateral effects, and the gap between operational intent and official statements could be maintained. Through careful documentation that described targets in military terms while achieving agricultural effects. Hospital and school strikes documented during the 1991 Gulf War revealed patterns in how civilian infrastructure casualties were categorized and explained. The Highway of Death incident in February 1991, when coalition aircraft attacked a convoy of Iraqi military and civilian vehicles retreating from Kuwait on Highway 80, resulted in extensive casualties documented through military records and subsequent investigations. The convoy included military vehicles, but also civilian cars and buses carrying Iraqi soldiers who were retreating and Palestinians, Kuwaitis, and other civilians fleeing Kuwait, and American aircraft conducted sustained attacks over several hours that destroyed hundreds of vehicles and killed an unknown number of people. Estimates range from hundreds to several thousand. Military officials, in post-operation briefings, described the attack as targeting legitimate military forces in retreat, arguing that retreating forces remained lawful targets until they surrendered. And operational reports framed the attack as a successful interdiction of Iraqi military units that might have regrouped and returned to combat. However, journalists who reached the site documented extensive evidence of civilian vehicles, personal belongings, and indicators that significant numbers of those killed were civilians or soldiers who were effectively fleeing rather than conducting an organized military retreat, and some military. Analysts questioned whether the scale and duration of attacks on forces that were clearly defeated and retreating crossed into excessive force. The legal framework applied was that retreating military forces remained combatants until surrender, that civilian presence in military convoys didn't grant protection to the convoy, and that pilots couldn't be expected to distinguish civilian vehicles and mixed convoys during combat operations. All positions that were legally defensible under interpretations of the laws of armed conflict, but that created space for what critics described as a massacre of fleeing forces. The incident received limited public attention compared to other aspects of the Gulf War, and no investigations into potential misconduct were conducted. with the attack treated as a successful military operation that happened to include civilian casualties as an unfortunate side effect. Beyond the highway of death, the Gulf War included documented strikes on infrastructure that served both civilian and military purposes: electrical plants, water treatment facilities, telecommunications centers, that Pentagon briefings described as legitimate military targets, but that humanitarian. Organizations documented as creating severe civilian hardship. The pattern was consistent with earlier conflicts. Dual-use infrastructure could be targeted, civilian consequences were framed as collateral damage, and strategic military effects justified humanitarian costs, all documented in operational reports that focused on military achievements while treating civilian suffering as regrettable but acceptable side effects of modern warfare. Depleted uranium's long shadow extended from the Gulf War through subsequent conflicts in ways that military and health authorities continue to dispute. During 1991, and then extensively during operations in Iraq from 2003 onward, NATO and American forces used depleted uranium munitions, extremely dense material left over from nuclear enrichment that's effective for penetrating armor, and the long-term health effects on civilian populations exposed to depleted uranium particles have been documented in epidemiological studies that show concerning patterns, though causation remains contested. The munitions use was documented in military records as standard anti-armor weaponry, with depleted uranium's effectiveness against tanks and armored vehicles making it tactically valuable. But what wasn't initially disclosed to Iraqi civilians, or even fully to military personnel, was that depleted uranium is mildly radioactive, and that particles created when it penetrates armor can be inhaled or ingested, with potential long-term health effects. Studies conducted by international health organizations and academic researchers in areas of Iraq where depleted uranium munitions were heavily used, particularly around Fallujah and Basra, documented significant increases in birth defects, childhood cancers, and other health problems in the years following conflicts, and researchers analyzing these patterns found correlations between proximity to areas where depleted uranium was used and incidence of health problems. The World Health Organization and other international bodies conducted studies examining these patterns, and while some studies found concerning correlations, others found results were inconclusive, and efforts to conduct comprehensive research were reportedly complicated by restrictions on access to data in affected areas. Declassified documents reveal that military planners were aware of potential health concerns related to depleted uranium before its extensive use. Studies conducted after the Gulf War showed some service members who handled damaged vehicles had elevated uranium levels, but the position maintained in official statements was that health risks were minimal, and that the military necessity of effective anti-armor weapons justified any theoretical long-term risks. The controversy became more acute when veterans of conflicts involving depleted uranium munitions reported unusual health problems, and when birth defect rates in affected Iraqi cities were documented at levels far above normal, and the military's response, consistent across administrations, was that studies showed no definitive causal link, that depleted uranium was safe under proper handling procedures, and that other factors, including conventional weapons residues and Iraq's deteriorating health infrastructure, could explain observed health patterns. The precedent was familiar. Weapons with potential long-term civilian health effects could be used extensively. Health monitoring would be minimal. Studies showing concerning patterns could be disputed or attributed to other factors, and the burden of proof would remain on those claiming harm, rather than on those deploying the weapons. The documentation existed, military knew about potential risks, health patterns were concerning, and suppression or limitation of research was documented in leaked emails and WHO internal correspondence, but institutional positions remain that evidence was insufficient to restrict weapons that were militarily effective. Black sites across Eastern Europe marked a systematic expansion of the post-9/11 interrogation regime. Between 2002 and 2006, the Central Intelligence Agency operated secret detention facilities in Poland, Romania, and other European locations, holding high-value detainees in what the agency's internal documents called black sites, facilities whose existence was classified, and whose operations were designed to occur outside standard legal frameworks and oversight mechanisms. The site's existence was confirmed through multiple investigations, including the Council of Europe's inquiry led by Swiss Senator Dick Marty, whose report detailed CIA rendition flights patterns, identified specific facilities, and documented systematic torture at these locations. The black site system was authorized at the highest levels of government through legal memoranda drafted by Justice Department officials, including John Yoo, whose opinions, later leaked and officially released, provided legal justification for interrogation techniques that clearly constituted torture under international law. The sites operated with elaborate secrecy. Detainees were transported on CIA-chartered aircraft, whose flight patterns were meticulously documented by investigative journalists and human rights organizations. Facilities were constructed in buildings isolated from civilian populations, and operations were concealed even from host countries' general populations, though evidence suggests senior officials in those governments were aware and had provided authorization. Detainees held at black sites were subjected to interrogation techniques that CIA's own internal communications, later released through Senate investigations, described in detail: waterboarding, sleep deprivation for days at a time, stress positions maintained for hours, confinement in small boxes, and other methods specifically designed to break psychological resistance. The CIA's justification, documented in agency assessments and official statements, was that these techniques were necessary to obtain intelligence from hardened terrorists who had been trained to resist standard interrogation, and that legal opinions from Justice Department had determined the techniques did not constitute torture under American law, creating a framework where interrogators believed they were operating legally despite using methods that were unambiguously torture under international definitions. The black site program's exposure came gradually through investigative journalism, then through detainees' accounts after some were eventually transferred to Guantanamo, and finally through official investigations including the Senate Intelligence Committee's report. And what these investigations revealed was systematic torture conducted with legal authorization, detailed medical monitoring to ensure detainees didn't die during interrogation, and extensive documentation that interrogators knew they were causing severe physical and psychological harm. The European Court of Human Rights eventually ruled on several black site cases, finding that governments had violated human rights obligations by hosting or facilitating the sites, and some countries paid compensation to victims, but no American officials faced prosecution, and CIA leadership maintained that the program had been effective and lawful under American legal interpretations, even if international courts disagreed. The precedent was complete. Systematic torture could be conducted at secret facilities. Legal memoranda could provide authorization that insulated interrogators from prosecution. Operations could be designed to occur outside territories where legal protections applied, and when exposed, claims of effectiveness and proper authorization could prevent accountability despite clear evidence of war crimes. Waterboarding's medical monitoring demonstrated how torture could be systematized through bureaucratic procedure. Between 2002 and 2003 at Guantanamo and at CIA black sites, interrogators used waterboarding, simulated drowning through controlled water application, on detainees including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee report released in 2014, was waterboarded 183 times during March 2003. The technique was implemented by psychologists James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, who were contracted by the CIA to develop and oversee the enhanced interrogation program despite having no experience with actual interrogation, and their protocols, documented in CIA cables and training materials, included detailed procedures for waterboarding sessions, including specific angles for the board, precise amounts of water to be applied, and required medical personnel presence to monitor vital signs. The medical monitoring aspect revealed the program's systematic nature. Physicians and psychologists were present during sessions not to prevent harm, but to ensure interrogators could push detainees to maximum psychological distress without killing them. And medical personnel kept detailed records, documenting waterboarding sessions, physical reactions, psychological effects, and recommendations for subsequent sessions. These records, portions of which were included in the Senate report, show that medical professionals understood they were facilitating torture and that their role was to enable maximum suffering while preventing death or permanent physical damage that might create evidence or complicate subsequent legal proceedings. The waterboarding sessions followed documented procedures. Detainee would be strapped to a board with feet elevated, face covered with cloth, water poured over the cloth to create sensation of drowning. Sessions continuing for specific durations with breaks to prevent death, and medical monitoring. Throughout to assess whether detainee could withstand additional sessions. Mitchell and Jessen's protocols, detailed in CIA documents, specified that waterboarding should continue until interrogators achieved psychological debilitation or until medical personnel determined further sessions posed unacceptable risk of death, creating a framework where torture was calibrated to maximize effect while minimizing evidence of harm. The Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation, based on review of millions of CIA documents, concluded that enhanced interrogation, including waterboarding, did not produce unique intelligence that prevented attacks, that claims of effectiveness were overstated or fabricated, and that the CIA had systematically misled Congress and the public about the program's results. The committee's report documented specific instances where CIA officials told Congress that intelligence from waterboarding had prevented attacks, but internal documents showed those intelligence leads had come from other sources or had not actually prevented any attacks. Despite these findings, no one faced prosecution. Justice Department reviews concluded that interrogators who followed approved procedures couldn't be prosecuted, and officials who approved the procedures claimed they relied on legal opinions stating the techniques were lawful. Mitchell and Jessen received millions in CIA contracts, and when sued by torture survivors, the case was settled with the government paying compensation but without admitting wrongdoing. The precedent held, torture could be systematically implemented through approved procedures. Medical professionals could facilitate torture under the guise of safety monitoring. Documented evidence that torture was ineffective didn't lead to accountability, and legal opinions providing authorization could shield everyone involved from prosecution. Stress positions become policy showed how Abu Ghraib's photographic evidence revealed systematic rather than isolated abuse. Between 2003 and 2004 at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, detainees were subjected to stress positions, sexual humiliation, beatings, and other abuses that became public when photographs taken by guards were leaked to media, and the subsequent Taguba report, an internal army investigation led by Major General Antonio Taguba, documented that abuse was systemic, resulted from policy decisions about interrogation practices, and was known to higher-level command. The photograph showed detainees forced to maintain painful positions for extended periods, stacked in naked pyramids, threatened with dogs, hooded and attached to wires, and subjected to various forms of sexual humiliation. And while initial military and political responses characterized this as misconduct by low-level guards, the Taguba report and subsequent investigations revealed that many techniques used at Abu Ghraib had been approved for use at Guantanamo and other facilities, and had migrated to Iraq through various official and unofficial channels. The approval chain for enhanced interrogation techniques, documented through military communications and legal memoranda, showed that techniques including stress positions, sleep deprivation, and exploitation of detainees' fears had been authorized by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld for use at Guantanamo, and that military intelligence personnel and CIA interrogators at Abu Ghraib had applied similar techniques, sometimes exceeding even the authorized parameters. Taguba's investigation interviewed guards and intelligence personnel who described receiving instructions from military intelligence and CIA personnel to soften up detainees for interrogation. A term that Taguba documented meant subjecting them to various forms of abuse designed to increase stress and compliance. The report found that military intelligence and CIA personnel had given guards lists of techniques to use, that these techniques were applied systematically rather than randomly, and that photographic documentation was sometimes required to show intelligence personnel that instructions had been followed. What made Abu Ghraib significant wasn't that abuse occurred. Abuse had been documented at other facilities. But that photographic evidence made denial impossible, and that subsequent investigations revealed the approval chain connecting abuse to policy decisions at the highest levels of defense. Department and intelligence agencies. Despite this documentation, accountability was carefully limited. Low-level guards were prosecuted and imprisoned. Intelligence personnel who had directed abuse were typically not charged. Officers who oversaw facilities received administrative punishments at most, and senior officials who had approved interrogation policies faced no consequences. General Taguba himself was later forced into retirement, and his report's classified annexes, which reportedly detailed command responsibility more extensively, remain partially classified. The precedent was managed through selective prosecution. Those who implemented torture could be held accountable, but those who authorized and systematized it were protected through claims that they were responding to intelligence needs in unprecedented circumstances, and that legal opinions had authorized their actions. Extraordinary rendition to torture states completed the system of outsourced abuse. Between 2001 and 2005, the CIA rendered dozens of detainees to countries including Egypt, Syria, Morocco, and others known for using torture, with the purpose, documented in CIA cables and legal memoranda, being to enable interrogation techniques that couldn't be conducted in U.S. custody while maintaining plausible deniability about American involvement in torture. The case of Khalid el-Masri, a German citizen, exemplified the program's operation and consequences. In late 2003, el-Masri was detained at a border crossing based on mistaken identity. His name was similar to a suspect's and was rendered to a CIA black site in Afghanistan where he was held for months, subjected to abuse, and eventually released when the CIA confirmed the mistaken identity. El-Masri's account, later corroborated through European investigations and CIA documents obtained through legal proceedings, described being stripped, beaten, subjected to forced anal examination, and held in solitary confinement in a facility where he could hear other detainees screaming during interrogations, and his description of the facility and flight patterns matched CIA rendition operations documented through flight records and investigations. The European Court of Human Rights in 2012 ruled that Macedonia had violated el-Masri's rights by handing him to the CIA and that his account was credible. And the court found that the CIA had indeed tortured el-Masri and that Macedonia bore responsibility for facilitating this torture, awarding him compensation and requiring Macedonia to acknowledge the violation. El-Masri was one of numerous cases where detainees were rendered to third countries for interrogation, with CIA documents showing that the purpose was explicitly to enable harsher interrogation than could be conducted in U.S. facilities, and that the CIA sought and received assurances from receiving countries that detainees would be interrogated using methods that would be illegal in American custody. The rendition program operated with legal authorization from Justice Department memoranda, arguing that the prohibition on transferring detainees to countries where they'd face torture could be satisfied through diplomatic assurances that torture wouldn't occur, even though internal CIA and State Department assessments documented that such assurances were meaningless, and that detainees rendered to these countries were routinely tortured. The program's documentation was extensive. Flight logs tracked rendition aircraft, cables documented specific cases, and reports described intelligence obtained through foreign interrogations. But this documentation also created evidence of systematic torture through proxy that would later complicate accountability. When rendition cases became public through detainee accounts and investigative reporting, the U.S. position was that diplomatic assurances had been obtained, that the U.S. couldn't control foreign countries' interrogation methods, and that intelligence obtained was valuable for counterterrorism operations, creating a framework of plausible deniability despite clear evidence that rendition's purpose was enabling torture while avoiding direct American responsibility. No American officials faced prosecution for extraordinary rendition. Legal opinions authorizing the practice were treated as good faith legal advice, and the program was eventually discontinued not because it was illegal, but because its exposure created diplomatic problems. The machinery had perfected its system, torture could be outsourced to foreign partners, legal frameworks could provide authorization, plausible deniability could be maintained through diplomatic assurances, and even when specific cases proved that torture had occurred as intended, accountability could be avoided through claims that individual cases were aberrations rather than the program's purpose. Civilian massacre becomes cover-up when military operations in Vietnam crossed from combat into systematic killing of unarmed villagers. On March 16, 1968, U.S. Army soldiers from Charlie Company entered the village of My Lai in South Vietnam's Quang Ngai province, and over the next 4 hours they systematically killed 504 civilians, including infants, children, women, and elderly men, with the massacre documented through subsequent Army investigations, soldier testimony, and photographs taken by Army photographer Ron Haberle. Lieutenant William Calley led the operation, and multiple soldiers later testified that Calley ordered them to kill everyone in the village, despite encountering no armed resistance and seeing clearly that villagers were unarmed civilians. The soldiers herded villagers into ditches and shot them, burned homes with families inside, and killed livestock, and the only thing that stopped the massacre was helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson, who witnessed the killings from above, landed his helicopter between soldiers and fleeing villagers, and threatened to fire on American troops if they continued. Thompson's after-action report described what he witnessed, but his account was ignored by immediate commanders, and the operation was initially reported as a successful engagement against Viet Cong forces, with a high enemy body count and minimal civilian casualties. The cover-up was systematic and involved multiple levels of command. Captain Ernest Medina, who commanded Charlie Company, reported the operation as a military success. Colonel Orrin Henderson, who commanded the brigade, accepted this account without investigation, and the official record described My Lai as a combat operation rather than a massacre. The truth only emerged a year later when former soldier Ron Ridenour, who had heard accounts from participants, wrote letters to Congress and the Pentagon describing the massacre, and investigative journalist Seymour Hersh pursued the story, eventually publishing accounts that forced Army investigation. The Pierce Commission, led by Lieutenant General William Pierce, conducted a thorough investigation that documented the massacre's scope and the cover-up's extent, finding that at least 24 officers knew about the massacre and either participated in covering it up or failed to report it, and the Commission's report, portions of which remained classified for decades, revealed institutional failures at every level of command. Despite extensive documentation of the massacre and cover-up, only Lieutenant Calley was convicted, receiving a life sentence that was later reduced to house arrest, and after serving 3.5 years under house arrest, he was released. No officers above Calley were convicted, Captain Medina was acquitted, and most officers implicated in the cover-up faced no criminal charges, with some receiving only administrative reprimands that didn't prevent career advancement. The My Lai massacre and its aftermath established a pattern that would repeat in subsequent conflicts. When atrocities occurred, initial reports minimized or concealed civilian casualties. Investigations were resisted until external pressure forced them. Documentation revealed systematic failures and command knowledge. But accountability was carefully limited to the lowest-ranking participants while protecting command structures. The precedent was clear, even when massacres were thoroughly documented and undeniably criminal. Institutional protection mechanisms could limit accountability, and proper reporting channels could be used to conceal rather than expose atrocities. Wedding party airstrikes repeated across years demonstrated how misidentification patterns became accepted operational risks. Between 2002 and 2008 in Afghanistan, coalition forces conducted multiple airstrikes on what were later determined to be wedding celebrations, killing dozens of civilians in incidents that were documented through Pentagon investigations, survivor testimony, and forensic analysis of strike sites. The pattern was consistent across incidents. Intelligence indicated militant activity or gatherings in specific locations. Airstrikes were authorized based on this intelligence, and subsequent investigation revealed that the targets were actually wedding parties or traditional celebratory. Gunfire had been misidentified as hostile action, or where faulty intelligence had misidentified civilian gatherings as militant meetings. In July 2002, an airstrike in Uruzgan province killed 48 civilians attending a wedding, with survivors describing how aircraft attacked the celebration after guests fired rifles in the air following local custom, and Pentagon investigation acknowledged the deaths were civilians, but maintained that pilots had followed proper procedures in responding to what appeared to be hostile fire. In November 2008, an airstrike in Kandahar province killed 37 civilians, including the bride and groom at a wedding party, with investigation revealing that intelligence had misidentified the wedding convoy as a Taliban gathering, and while the Pentagon acknowledged the error and paid compensation to survivors, no changes to targeting procedures resulted from the incident. These were not isolated cases. Similar incidents occurred in 2004, 2006, and multiple times in 2008, each following similar patterns of intelligence failure or misidentification, followed by official acknowledgement of error, but no criminal charges or substantial policy changes. The investigation's findings consistently showed that procedures had been followed, that intelligence available to commanders had seemed credible at the time, that pilots couldn't distinguish wedding celebrations from militant gatherings from altitude, and that the operational tempo and threat environment made some civilian casualties from misidentification statistically inevitable. This framing transformed repeated massacres of civilians at celebrations into acceptable operational risks, and the compensation payments, typically several $1,000s per death paid to survivors, became routine administrative procedures rather than acknowledgments of criminal conduct. Pentagon briefings on wedding party strikes consistently emphasized that forces were operating in good faith based on available intelligence, that distinguishing civilians from combatants was challenging in Afghanistan's operational environment, and that while errors were regrettable, they didn't indicate failures of policy or procedure. The pattern of wedding party strikes demonstrated how civilian casualty incidents could be systematically normalized. Each incident was investigated, errors were acknowledged, compensation was paid, but the fundamental approach that generated the pattern remained unchanged. The precedent held that misidentification leading to civilian deaths was a tragic but acceptable consequence of operations. That following proper procedures before strikes insulated operators from criminal liability, even when those procedures repeatedly failed to prevent civilian massacres. And that repeated similar incidents didn't require fundamental changes to targeting policies as long as each individual incident could be categorized as an unfortunate error rather than criminal negligence. Fallujah's white phosphorus use showed how chemical weapons classifications could be circumvented through tactical definitions. During November 2004's Operation Phantom Fury in Fallujah, Iraq, U.S. Marines used white phosphorus munitions extensively throughout the city, and while the military initially denied using white phosphorus against personnel, subsequent acknowledgments confirmed its use in ways that raised questions about compliance with chemical weapons protocols. White phosphorus burns at extremely high temperatures when exposed to air, creating distinctive effects on human tissue, and its use is regulated under international protocols that prohibit chemical weapons. Though military forces argue that white phosphorus used for illumination or smoke screening is a conventional munition rather than a chemical weapon. The initial revelation came from embedded journalists and documentary filmmakers who documented white phosphorus's distinctive effects in Fallujah. An Italian television broadcast a documentary showing evidence of white phosphorus burns on civilian bodies and interviewing survivors who described the attack's effects. The Pentagon initially issued statements denying that white phosphorus had been used against people, characterizing it as used only for illumination and obscuration, but subsequent investigations and internal military documents revealed that white phosphorus had been used as a direct fire weapon. In shake-and-bake operations, where high explosive rounds forced insurgents from covered positions, and white phosphorus rounds were then fired into those positions to attack exposed personnel. Military field artillery journals published after the battle included articles describing these tactics in detail, with authors celebrating white phosphorus's effectiveness for urban combat and recommending its expanded use in similar operations. And these publications revealed that white phosphorus use against personnel was not accidental or incidental, but was a deliberate tactical choice by commanders who viewed it as an effective weapon for clearing fortified urban positions. The legal framework supporting white phosphorus use rested on distinguishing between conventional incendiary weapons and chemical weapons. White phosphorus burns through heat and flame rather than through toxic chemicals. Therefore, it could be categorized as an incendiary weapon rather than a chemical weapon, and while protocols restrict incendiary weapons' use in civilian areas, military officials argued that Fallujah had been evacuated of civilians before the operation, making the entire city a legitimate combat zone where incendiary weapons could be used. This framing ignored extensive documentation from Iraqi medical personnel and international observers, showing that thousands of civilians remained in Fallujah during the operation, that white phosphorus had been used in populated areas, and that civilian casualties from white phosphorus included women, children, and elderly who clearly weren't combatants. When confronted with evidence of civilian casualties from white phosphorus, the military position shifted from denial to acknowledgement that white phosphorus had been used, but maintaining that such use was legal under military interpretations of applicable law. The precedent established through Fallujah was that weapons with effects similar to prohibited chemical weapons could be used extensively if they could be technically classified as conventional munitions, that civilian presence in combat zones could be officially denied even when documented. Evidence showed otherwise, and that legal interpretations favorable to military operations would be maintained despite international criticism. No investigations into potential war crimes were conducted. Officers who authorized white phosphorus use faced no consequences. And the tactical lessons from Fallujah, including white phosphorus use, were incorporated into doctrine for future urban operations. Haditha killings and command silence revealed how initial cover-ups could delay but not prevent exposure. On November 19, 2005, in Haditha, Iraq, U.S. Marines from Kilo Company killed 24 Iraqi civilians, including women and children in their homes, and the incident was initially reported as civilian casualties from a roadside bomb and subsequent firefight with insurgents, but investigation triggered by Time magazine's reporting revealed that Marines had systematically gone through homes shooting unarmed civilians in what appeared to be retribution for a bomb attack that had killed one Marine. The initial reporting was consistent with patterns established in earlier conflicts. Marines reported that an eyed explosion had killed one Marine and injured others, and that subsequent engagement with insurgents had resulted in civilian casualties caught in crossfire, and this account was accepted and passed up the chain of command without immediate investigation, despite some Marines raising concerns about what had actually occurred. Time magazine reporters received tips from Iraqi human rights workers who had documented the killings and had collected evidence including death certificates showing gunshot wounds rather than blast injuries, and testimony from survivors describing Marines entering homes and shooting unarmed family members. The magazine's investigation, published in March 2006, included photographs showing victims with gunshot wounds at close range, accounts from survivors describing the attacks, and documentation that raised serious questions about the official account of a firefight. The resulting military investigation documented in Naval Criminal Investigative Service reports and court-martial proceedings, revealed that after the Ide explosion, Staff Sergeant Frank Wuderick had led Marines in clearing nearby houses. And during these operations, Marines had shot multiple civilians at close range, including unarmed men, women in bedrooms with children, and a man in a wheelchair. The investigation found that initial reporting had been inaccurate, that commanders had accepted reports without scrutinizing evidence, and that Haditha represented a failure of discipline and command oversight, but it also revealed that senior officers had not immediately questioned accounts even when evidence suggested problems. Multiple Marines were initially charged, but over time charges against most were dropped or reduced, and Wuderick eventually pleaded guilty to a single count of dereliction of duty, receiving a rank reduction and pay cut but no prison time. The officer who had initially accepted the misleading report faced no criminal charges. An investigation into whether commanders had deliberately covered up the incident or simply failed to investigate properly was inconclusive. The pattern was familiar from My Lai and other incidents. Initial reports concealed atrocities, external pressure forced investigation, documented evidence revealed criminal conduct, but accountability was limited through charge reductions, plea deals, and immunity agreements with command. Responsibility rarely established, and senior officers typically protected. The Haditha investigations revealed institutional problems with how civilian casualty incidents were reported and investigated, leading to some procedural reforms. But the fundamental dynamic remained. When atrocities occurred, initial reports protected units in command. Investigations occurred only under external pressure, and even when investigations documented criminal conduct, military justice processes often resulted in minimal accountability. The machinery had refined its approach. Documentation existed, investigations occurred, but outcomes were carefully managed to minimize impact on institutional interests and command structures. Drone strikes without identity confirmation marked a fundamental shift in how targeting decisions were made and civilian casualties were categorized. Between 2009 and 2016, the United States conducted hundreds of drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and other locations using signature strikes. Attacks authorized based on patterns of behavior rather than confirmed identification of targets, and investigations by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and other organizations, based on field research and leaked classified documents, documented that approximately 90% of those killed in some drone campaigns were not the intended targets. The signature strike policy, authorized at senior levels and documented in presidential policy guidance that was partially declassified, allowed strikes against individuals whose identities were unknown, but whose behavior patterns matched profiles associated with militants. And these patterns could include being military-age males in areas where militant groups operated, gathering in groups, or displaying weapons in conflict zones where weapons were common. The framework meant that individuals could be killed by drone strike without anyone knowing who they were or having specific evidence of their involvement in hostile actions, with the justification being that militant groups' operational patterns could be identified and targeted, even when specific. Individuals couldn't be named. The operational reality, documented through leaked intelligence assessments and investigative journalism based on field interviews with survivors and witnesses, was that many killed in signature strikes were civilians going about daily activities that fit targeting profiles, attending tribal meetings that appeared to be militant gatherings, or simply being present in areas where surveillance had identified suspicious patterns. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism's detailed database of drone strikes, compiled from field investigations, local news reports, and leaked documents, showed consistent patterns of strikes that killed civilians, including children, that official counts of combatant deaths were systematically inflated by categorizing all military-age males as combatants unless proven otherwise, and that many strikes occurred at funerals, weddings, or community gatherings that intelligence had misidentified as militant meetings. The methodology for determining who was a combatant versus civilian was revealed in leaked documents to be extraordinarily broad. Any military-age male in a strike zone was counted as a combatant, unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent, meaning that the default assumption was guilt and that civilians were only recognized as such if evidence emerged after their deaths, proving they weren't militants. This framework inverted normal burdens of proof and meant that official casualty statistics bore little resemblance to actual civilian death tolls, and it also meant that operators conducting strikes often didn't know who they were killing and had no mechanism to reliably distinguish militants. From civilians, the authorization process for signature strikes, documented through leaked intelligence protocols, required approval from senior officials, but didn't require identification of specific targets, creating situations where authorization chains approved strikes against unidentified individuals based on behavioral profiles that subsequent investigations revealed often matched civilian activities. When civilian casualties from signature strikes became public through investigative journalism and testimony from survivors, the official response followed established patterns, acknowledging that civilian casualties occurred while maintaining that strikes followed proper procedures, emphasizing that militants deliberately operated near civilians to complicate targeting, and arguing that civilian casualties, while regrettable, were proportional to the strategic value of disrupting militant operations. The legal framework supporting signature strikes relied on broad interpretations of self-defense and military necessity, arguing that individuals displaying patterns associated with militant activity in areas where militant groups operated could be lawfully targeted even without specific evidence of their participation in hostilities, and this interpretation was maintained in classified legal memoranda, despite objections from international legal experts and some internal government lawyers who argued it violated fundamental targeting principles. The precedent established was that killing could occur based on algorithmic behavior patterns, rather than individual identification, that civilian casualties could be systematically undercounted through definitional frameworks that assumed guilt, and that classified legal interpretations could authorize targeting policies that appeared to violate international humanitarian law. No one faced accountability for civilian deaths from signature strikes. Policies remained classified for years, preventing public debate. And when partially declassified, official documents minimized civilian casualties through counting methodologies designed to produce low numbers. The double-tap targeting pattern revealed deliberate tactics that intentionally targeted rescuers and first responders. During 2012 in Pakistan's tribal areas, drone operators began implementing a strike pattern where an initial strike would hit a target and a follow-up strike would hit the same location minutes or hours later when rescuers and community members arrived to help casualties and recover bodies. And investigations by Stanford Law School and New York University Law School, based on field research and witness testimony, documented that this pattern was systematic rather than coincidental, and that it deliberately exploited predictable civilian responses to strikes. The tactics documentation came from multiple sources. Survivors and witnesses described consistent patterns of second strikes hitting rescue efforts. Medical personnel reported being unable to respond to strike sites due to fear of follow-up attacks. And leaked operational procedures showed that multiple strike patterns were part of targeting protocols. The Stanford New report, titled Living Under Drones, included extensive testimony from Pakistani civilians and medical workers describing the second strike pattern and its effects on communities, with witnesses explaining that villagers were afraid to help strike victims because helping could mean death in a follow-up strike, that ambulances and rescue vehicles wouldn't approach strike sites, and that bodies sometimes remained at strike locations for hours because collecting them was too dangerous. The intentional targeting of first responders constitutes a potential war crime under international humanitarian law, which requires protection for medical personnel and those rendering aid to the wounded, but leaked operational documents suggested that follow-up strikes were justified through frameworks claiming that first responders at strike sites could be militants rather than civilians, and that gatherings at strike sites represented valid targets. This logic created space for deliberately targeting rescue efforts while maintaining technical compliance with rules requiring legitimate military targets, and the operational effect was to terrorize communities through tactics that made helping strike victims potentially fatal and that prevented Medical care for wounded. The psychological impact documented in the Stanford New Report included community members describing constant anxiety from drone presence. The distinctive sound of drones overhead had become associated with imminent death. Children were too afraid to attend school when drones were audible, and normal activities like outdoor work or community gatherings were curtailed because gatherings were known to be targeted. Some witnesses described symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, triggered specifically by drone presence and strike patterns, and medical workers described unable to fulfill basic humanitarian obligations because doing so would make them targets. When the double tap pattern was exposed through investigative reporting and human rights research, official responses were minimal. Some officials denied the pattern existed. Others suggested that any casualties in follow-up strikes were militants who had responded to initial strikes. And classification prevented detailed public debate about whether the tactics were authorized and by whom. The legal framework was murky. Leaked operational guidance suggested the tactic was employed, but official statements denied deliberately targeting first responders while maintaining that all strikes complied with law of armed conflict, creating rhetorical space to avoid admitting what field. Evidence clearly documented. The precedent was that tactics deliberately targeting humanitarian response could be implemented while officially denied. That effects on civilian populations could be documented by researchers and ignored by policymakers. And that classification could prevent accountability even when tactics appeared to clearly violate international humanitarian law. No investigations into double-tap targeting were conducted, no policy changes resulted from exposure of the pattern, and drone operations continued with similar civilian impact patterns despite growing documentation of systematic problems. Hospital destruction in Kunduz demonstrated how obvious errors could be investigated without accountability. On October 3, 2015, a U.S. AC-130 gunship conducted sustained attacks on a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, operated by Doctors Without Borders, killing 42 people including medical staff and patients. And the attack continued for over an hour despite hospital staff making repeated phone calls to American and Afghan military officials identifying the facility as a protected hospital and requesting the attack stop. The hospital's coordinates had been provided to all military forces operating in the area, its location was well known, and it was clearly marked with the symbols indicating protected medical facility, yet the gunship made multiple firing passes, targeting specific parts of the building including the intensive care unit where patients were unable to evacuate. Doctors Without Borders immediately called the attack a war crime and demanded independent investigation, describing how staff and patients were killed in hospital beds, how those attempting to flee were shot, and how the attack continued despite repeated communications identifying the facility as a hospital. The U.S. military's initial response went through several versions within hours. First claiming the strike targeted Taliban fighters, then claiming that Afghan forces under fire had requested air support, then acknowledging that the hospital had been struck but suggesting that Taliban forces had used it as a position, and finally acknowledging that the hospital had been the intended target of the strike, but claiming it was a mistake based on faulty intelligence. The shifting explanations undermined credibility and suggested institutional confusion about what had actually occurred and why. The military investigation, conducted by CENTCOM and summarized in public reports while detailed findings remain classified, concluded that the strike resulted from multiple failures, including misidentification of the target, failures of operational procedures, and equipment problems, but classified the incident as tragic mistake rather than war crime, and determined that while procedures weren't followed properly, no criminal charges were warranted. The investigation found that the aircrew believed they were targeting a different building several hundred meters away where Taliban fighters were reportedly located, that equipment problems and procedural failures led to misidentification, and that once the attack began, failures in communication prevented it from stopping despite hospital staff's calls. What the investigation minimized was that the attack continued for over an hour, that the building was clearly marked as a hospital, that its coordinates were known, that staff made repeated contact attempting to stop the attack, and that the sustained nature of the engagement suggested that at some point operators should have recognized they were attacking a hospital. Doctors Without Borders rejected the investigation's conclusions, maintaining that the sustained and precise nature of the attack, targeting specific hospital areas including the intensive care unit, suggested deliberate targeting rather than mistake. And the organization noted that the attack occurred at a time when Afghan forces were trying to retake Kunduz and may have believed that wounded Taliban were being treated at the hospital. The legal framework applied was that mistakes in targeting, even catastrophic mistakes that destroyed protected facilities and killed dozens, didn't constitute war crimes if operators believed they were attacking legitimate targets. And this framework meant that no one faced criminal charges. Despite an obvious violation of international humanitarian law's fundamental protections for medical facilities, 16 military personnel received administrative punishments, letters of reprimand, suspension, retraining requirements, but no criminal charges, and the precedent was clear. Even the destruction of a clearly marked hospital with dozens of deaths could be categorized as tragic error rather than criminal conduct. Investigations could be conducted internally without independent oversight, and administrative penalties could substitute for criminal accountability. The United States paid compensation and condolence payments, but never acknowledged war crime liability, and the incident became another data point in patterns showing that investigations could be thorough in documenting failures while carefully avoiding criminal accountability. Mosul's civilian death toll hidden showed how modern urban warfare's consequences could be systematically undercounted. During the 2017 campaign to retake Mosul, Iraq, from ISIS, coalition airstrikes conducted as part of the operation killed thousands of civilians. Exact numbers remain disputed, but investigations by Amnesty International and other organizations documented at least several thousand. Deaths from airstrikes in densely populated areas where civilians were trapped by fighting. The coalition's official civilian casualty count, maintained through a process that required significant evidence before acknowledging civilian deaths, recognized only a fraction of documented deaths, and the methodology for counting created systematic undercounting that obscured the campaigns. Civilian toll. Amnesty International's investigation, based on field research examining strike sites, interviewing survivors, and analyzing satellite imagery and weapons effects, documented specific strikes that killed large numbers of civilians, sheltering in buildings, and the organization's reports included case studies of individual strikes where dozens of civilians died in buildings the coalition had targeted without apparently knowing civilians were present. The pattern Amnesty documented showed strikes hitting buildings where ISIS fighters were present, but where significantly more civilians were also trapped. Strikes hitting civilian infrastructure, including markets and homes, and coalition targeting procedures that appeared insufficient for the urban environment's complexity, where distinguishing combatants from civilians was extremely difficult, and where ISIS was using civilian presence as shields. The coalition's position, maintained in official statements and in responses to casualty reports, was that ISIS deliberately put civilians at risk by fighting from populated areas, that coalition forces took extensive measures to minimize civilian casualties, and that the civilian deaths that did occur were tragic, but were ISIS's responsibility rather than coalition's. This framing shifted responsibility from those conducting strikes to those being targeted, arguing that ISIS's tactics forced coalition into situations where civilian casualties were inevitable, and it also suggested that civilian deaths should be attributed to ISIS for using human shields rather than to coalition for conducting strikes that killed civilians. The legal framework was that civilian presence didn't make buildings immune from targeting if military objectives were present, that proportionality assessments balanced military advantage against expected civilian harm, and that these assessments were made in good faith by operators based on available intelligence. What this framework obscured was that the operational tempo and targeting decisions were choices, the pace of operations, the types of weapons used, the level of certainty required before strikes, and the acceptable level of civilian risk were all policy decisions that could have been made differently. Investigations by journalists who examined Mosul after ISIS's defeat documented entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble with civilian bodies still buried in the wreckage, with survivors describing sustained bombardment that destroyed buildings where families were trapped because leaving meant being shot by ISIS and staying meant being bombed by coalition. The disconnect between official casualty counts of several hundred acknowledged civilian deaths and investigations documenting several thousand deaths revealed systematic problems with how civilian casualties were counted and acknowledged, with methodologies that required extensive evidence before acknowledging deaths, creating situations where most civilian deaths went unacknowledged in official statistics. When confronted with discrepancies between official counts and independent investigations, the military response was that counting civilian casualties in active combat zones was extremely difficult, that independent investigations sometimes relied on unreliable sources, and that official counts reflected deaths that could be confirmed through thorough investigation processes. The precedent was that massive civilian casualties could occur in urban warfare operations, that official casualty counts could systematically undercount deaths through methodological frameworks designed to require high levels of proof, and that responsibility for civilian deaths could be shifted to enemies for fighting in populated areas rather than to those conducting strikes that killed civilians. No systematic review of targeting decisions in Mosul occurred, no commanders faced consequences for the civilian toll, and lessons learned focused on tactical improvements rather than questioning whether the operational approach that generated such casualties should have been fundamentally different. Pentagon Papers reveal systemic lies when classified documents expose decades of fabricated justifications for war. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst who had worked on the top secret study of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam, leaked 7,000 pages of classified documents to the New York Times and other newspapers, and these documents, which became known as the Pentagon Papers, revealed that 4 presidential administrations had systematically misled the public about America's involvement in Vietnam, expanding the war while publicly claiming to seek peace in continuing operations despite internal assessments concluding the war was unwinnable. The papers documented that the Johnson administration had planned to escalate the war months before the 1964 election, while Johnson campaigned as the peace candidate, that the Gulf of Tonkin incident used to justify escalation had been misrepresented with officials knowing the evidence was questionable, and that internal assessments consistently showed the war was failing while public statements claimed progress. The Supreme Court ruled in New York Times Co. v. United States that the government couldn't prevent publication, establishing important press freedom precedent, but the document's content revealed something more troubling than classification: systematic lying to the American public about war objectives, progress, and prospects spanning multiple administrations. Ellsberg faced prosecution under the Espionage Act with charges that could have resulted in over 100 years in prison. But the case was dismissed after revelations that the Nixon administration had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, seeking damaging information, and had engaged in other illegal activities attempting to discredit him. The precedent was mixed. Whistleblowers exposing government lies faced severe prosecution, but government misconduct during prosecution could result in dismissal, and the fundamental revelation that administrations had systematically lied about war for years resulted in no accountability for those who had conducted the deception. Torture memos become public when legal opinions drafted to authorize interrogation techniques were leaked and officially released through Freedom of Information requests. Between 2004 and 2009, memoranda written by Justice Department lawyers, including John Yoo and Jay Bybee, which provided legal authorization for CIA Enhanced Interrogation Program, became public through various channels, and these memos revealed the legal framework, constructed to permit interrogation techniques that clearly constituted torture under international law. The memos redefined torture narrowly, arguing that only pain equivalent to organ failure or death constituted torture, and provided specific authorization for waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, and other techniques by arguing they didn't meet this restrictive definition. Use legal reasoning, detailed in memos dated August 2002, relied on expansive interpretations of presidential authority during wartime, arguing that as commander-in-chief, the president had constitutional authority that couldn't be limited by statutes or treaties, effectively placing interrogation decisions beyond legal constraint. The memo's public release through a clue Freedom of Information litigation revealed not just specific techniques authorized, but the legal architecture constructed to insulate interrogators and officials from prosecution. By obtaining legal opinions stating techniques were lawful, interrogators could claim good faith reliance on legal advice, and officials who authorized programs could claim they had followed proper legal procedures. When the memos became public, they generated significant controversy, with legal scholars and former Justice Department officials condemning the legal reasoning as tortured logic designed to reach predetermined conclusions. But no one who drafted the memos faced professional consequences. Returned to teaching law, Bybee remained a federal judge, and the Office of Professional Responsibility Investigation concluded their legal reasoning was flawed, but didn't recommend disciplinary action. The precedent was complete. Lawyers could draft opinions authorizing clearly illegal conduct. Those opinions could provide legal cover for systematic torture, and even when the reasoning was exposed as fundamentally flawed, professional consequences could be avoided through claims of good faith. Legal analysis during unprecedented circumstances. WikiLeaks' collateral murder video brought the reality of modern warfare into public view with shocking clarity. In April 2010, WikiLeaks published classified military video from a July 2007 incident in Baghdad, where U.S. Apache helicopter crews killed 12 people, including 2 Reuters journalists. And the video, with audio of crew communications, showed helicopters firing on a group that included the journalists, then firing on a van that stopped to help wounded, killing the driver and seriously injuring 2 children inside. The video's impact came from showing warfare from operators' perspective, with their communications audible. Crew members identified cameras as weapons, joked about casualties, and celebrated kills. And when the van arrived to help wounded, crew members urged approval to engage, and received it. Despite no evidence the van posed threat, Reuters journalists Namir Noor-el-Din and Saeed Kama were carrying cameras, which crew members identified as weapons from helicopter distance, and after initial shooting wounded Kama, the van that stopped to help him was immediately engaged, killing the driver and severely wounding his 2 children who were in the vehicle. The military had investigated the incident after Reuters requested information about their journalists' deaths, and had concluded that crew members acted appropriately within rules of engagement, that they had reasonable belief individuals on the ground posed threats, and that engagement of the van was justified based on continuing hostile action assessment. The video's release challenged this conclusion by showing that camera equipment had been misidentified as weapons, that wounded posed no threat when the van was engaged, and that crew communications suggested insufficient care in distinguishing civilians from combatants. The video became controversial, with some viewing it as evidence of war crimes and others defending it as showing difficult split-second decisions in combat environments where distinguishing threats was genuinely difficult. The military's response emphasized that crew members had followed rules of engagement as they understood them, that video from distance made identification challenging, and that investigation had found no violations. No one faced charges. The incident was treated as tragic mistake rather than criminal conduct. And the precedent held, Footage showing questionable killings could be investigated with conclusions that procedures were followed. And video evidence showing civilian deaths could be framed as demonstrating combat's difficulty rather than violations of law. Afghanistan War Logs publication exposed unreported civilian casualties in kill-capture missions operating without adequate oversight. In July 2010, WikiLeaks published over 75,000 classified military reports from Afghanistan, covering the period from 2004 to 2009, and these documents revealed systematic problems including Task Force 373, a classified unit conducting kill-or capture missions against high-value targets with numerous incidents of civilian casualties that hadn't been publicly reported. The logs documented patterns of civilian casualties from coalition operations that exceeded official public casualty counts, showed that Taliban attacks were more frequent than publicly acknowledged, and revealed concerns about Pakistan's intelligence service supporting Taliban forces while Pakistan was officially a U.S. ally receiving significant aid. Task Force 373's activities, detailed in the leaked reports, showed the unit operating with special authorities to kill or capture individuals on a classified target list called the Joint Priorities Effects List, and incidents documented in the logs included the unit calling in airstrikes that killed civilians, operations where civilians were killed during night raids, and missions where uncertain intelligence led to targeting errors. The documents showed that these incidents were reported within military systems but often weren't publicly disclosed, that investigations into civilian casualties frequently concluded that forces had acted within rules, but that civilian deaths were regrettable consequences of operations, and that the operational tempo and authorities under which the unit operated created systematic risks of civilian casualties. The log's publication was controversial, with the military arguing that releasing classified operational reports endangered troops and Afghan civilians who had cooperated with coalition forces by revealing names and operational methods, and the Pentagon conducted damage assessments examining whether the leaks resulted in deaths, though no specific casualties were definitively attributed to the publication. The legal and ethical debate focused on whether WikiLeaks had responsibility to redact information that could endanger individuals versus the public value of exposing unreported civilian casualties and questionable operations, and whether the classification system was being used appropriately to protect security versus to conceal problematic operations from oversight. Chelsea Manning, the Army intelligence analyst who provided documents to WikiLeaks, was convicted of violating the Espionage Act and other charges, receiving a 35-year sentence, later commuted to 7 years. And the prosecution focused on unauthorized disclosure of classified information, rather than on whether disclosed information revealed misconduct. The precedent reinforced patterns from earlier leak cases. Whistleblowers face severe prosecution, while misconduct revealed in leaks rarely led to accountability for those conducting questionable operations. Low-level convictions protect command when Abu Ghraib prosecutions carefully limited accountability to junior personnel. Between 2004 and 2006, 11 soldiers were convicted for abuses at Abu Ghraib prison, with Specialist Lindy England receiving 3 years in prison and Specialist Charles Grainer receiving 10 years, but no officers above the level of company commander faced criminal charges despite the Taguba report and other investigations documenting that interrogation policies approved at senior levels had created the environment enabling systematic abuse. The trials focused on specific acts of abuse documented in photographs, forcing detainees into stress positions, using dogs to terrorize detainees, sexual humiliation, and prosecutors presented these as misconduct by individual soldiers exceeding their authority rather than as implementation of approved interrogation policies. England's defense argued she was following orders from military intelligence and CIA personnel who wanted detainees softened up for interrogation, and evidence presented at trial showed that intelligence personnel had given guards lists of approved techniques, but prosecutors maintained that even if directives came from intelligence personnel, the specific acts photographed exceeded any authorized techniques. The distinction allowed prosecution of photographed abuses while protecting the policy framework that had authorized coercive interrogation, and it allowed senior officials to characterize Abu Ghraib as failure of discipline rather than policy implementation. Officers who commanded Abu Ghraib faced administrative rather than criminal consequences. General Janis Karpinski was demoted and reprimanded, but not prosecuted, and Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Jordan faced court-martial charges that were largely dismissed with only minor violations resulting in reprimand. The pattern showed systematic protection of command responsibility. Investigations documented that senior officials knew about interrogation policies and their implementation, that techniques used at Abu Ghraib had been approved for other facilities, and that command failures had enabled abuse. But criminal accountability was carefully limited to those who had implemented abuse rather than those who had authorized or encouraged it. When asked about command responsibility, military officials emphasized that leadership had failed to provide adequate oversight, but that criminal culpability required direct involvement in specific abuses rather than policy decisions that created conditions for abuse. Pardons for convicted war criminals demonstrated how political intervention could override military justice. In November 2019, President Trump granted pardons or clemency to 3 service members convicted or accused of war crimes, including Navy SEAL Edward Gallagher, who had been convicted of posing with a corpse and acquitted of murder charges after several SEALs testified he had killed a wounded ISIS prisoner and shot civilians. Gallagher's case had been controversial within the SEAL community, with members of his platoon reporting his actions and testifying against him, and military prosecutors had pursued murder charges based on testimony from SEALs who described Gallagher stabbing a wounded prisoner receiving medical treatment and bragging about kills that included civilians. The trial resulted in acquittal on murder charges after the prosecution's key witness gave testimony that unexpectedly claimed responsibility for the prisoner's death, raising questions about witness credibility and whether SEAL community pressure had influenced testimony. Gallagher was convicted only of the lesser charge of posing with a corpse, sentenced to reduced rank and 4 months confinement with credit for time served. But Trump intervened to restore his rank and later issued a full pardon. The intervention outraged some military justice advocates who argued that presidential pardons for war crimes undermine military discipline and sent message that combat violations would be excused, and several Navy officials resigned in protest when Trump overruled Navy plans to remove. Gallagher's SEAL status. Trump's position, stated publicly, was that Gallagher and other pardoned service members were warriors who had been treated unfairly by military justice system, and that combat conditions made such cases complex, requiring understanding rather than prosecution. The pardons created precedent that political intervention could override military justice even in war crimes cases, that convictions resulting from extensive investigations and trials could be undone through executive clemency, and that service members considering reporting war crimes might conclude that command would not support accountability if political factors favored accused. Immunity deals block prosecution when contractors operating in war zones received legal protections that prevented accountability. In September 2007, Blackwater security contractors killed 17 Iraqi civilians at Nisour Square in Baghdad, opening fire on vehicles in a traffic circle with survivors and witnesses describing unprovoked shooting that continued even as civilians tried to flee. FBI investigation confirmed that the shooting was unjustified and that most of the 17 killed posed no threat, and federal prosecutors pursued criminal charges against the contractors involved. However, the prosecution faced immediate problems because State Department officials had granted contractors immunity in exchange for their statements during initial investigation conducted immediately after the incident, and defense lawyers argued this immunity tainted the entire case-making. Prosecution impossible. The immunity grants revealed systematic problems with how contractors were treated in war zones. They operated under legal frameworks that made accountability difficult. State Department officials overseeing contractors prioritized maintaining operational relationships over preserving criminal prosecution options, and immediate grants of immunity in exchange for statements about incidents created legal obstacles to subsequent prosecution. The case proceeded through years of legal challenges with convictions eventually obtained in 2014. 4 contractors received sentences ranging from 30 years to life. But these convictions were overturned on appeal in 2017 based on sentencing issues and other legal problems, and in 2020, Trump granted full pardons to all 4. The progression showed how contractors who killed civilians could avoid accountability through multiple mechanisms: immunity deals that complicated prosecution, legal frameworks that made jurisdiction unclear, and eventual pardons that overrode even successful prosecutions. Iraqi government protested the pardons as violation of Iraqi sovereignty, and as demonstrating that Americans could kill Iraqis without consequences, and the incident remained point of tension in U.S.-Iraq relations. The precedent was that contractors operating in war zones existed in legal gray zones where accountability was difficult, that officials managing contractors could grant immunity in ways that blocked prosecution, and that even when accountability was achieved through extensive effort, political intervention could eliminate it. Investigation threats and sanctions showed how international accountability mechanisms could be actively opposed. In 2020, the United States imposed visa restrictions and financial sanctions on International Criminal Court prosecutors and officials involved in investigating potential war crimes by Americans in Afghanistan, marking unprecedented action by one nation to coerce international court to drop investigations. The IC had been examining potential war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Afghanistan by all parties, including Taliban, Afghan forces, and American forces and CIA personnel. And the prosecutor's office had collected evidence suggesting systematic abuse by American forces deserving investigation. The U.S. position, articulated in Trump administration statements and reflected in sanctions imposed, was that IC lacked jurisdiction over Americans, that investigating American service members was political rather than legal action, and that U.S. wouldn't accept international court's authority over its citizens. The sanctions targeted ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda and other officials, freezing assets and restricting travel, and administration officials stated explicitly that sanctions were designed to pressure court to drop investigations of Americans. The legal framework supporting U.S. opposition was that America hadn't ratified the Rome Statute creating IC, that Afghanistan's IC membership didn't grant court jurisdiction over Americans operating there, and that U.S. had adequate domestic mechanisms for investigating misconduct, making international investigation unnecessary. This position ignored that domestic investigations of Afghanistan abuses had resulted in limited accountability, and that IC jurisdiction was designed precisely for situations where domestic accountability was insufficient. The sanctions represented escalation of long-standing U.S. opposition to IC. Congress had previously passed the American Service Members Protection Act, authorizing use of force to free Americans held by IC. But actually imposing sanctions on court officials was unprecedented assertion that international justice mechanisms couldn't examine American actions even in conflicts where evidence suggested potential war crimes. International legal experts condemned sanctions as attack on international justice system, and court officials stated investigations would continue despite pressure, but practical effect was to demonstrate that U.S. would actively oppose accountability mechanisms it didn't control. The precedent was absolute. International legal frameworks could be rejected through combination of non-participation and active coercion. Investigations could be opposed through sanctions and threats. And American exceptionalism meant accepting international jurisdiction over others while rejecting it for Americans. Hague Invasion Act passed when Congress authorized potential military action to prevent IC trials of Americans. In August 2002, Congress passed and President Bush signed the American Service Members Protection Act, legislation that authorized the president to use all means necessary and appropriate to free American personnel held by the International Criminal Court, including potential military force against IC facilities in The Hague, Netherlands. The legislation which critics immediately dubbed the Hague Invasion Act, prohibited U.S. cooperation with IC, barred military aid to countries that ratified the Rome Statute unless they agreed not to surrender Americans to court, and specifically authorized military action to extract Americans from IC custody. The act's passage reflected bipartisan opposition to international court jurisdiction over Americans, with supporters arguing that IC could be used for politically motivated prosecutions of American service members, and that U.S. Constitution didn't permit international legal authority over Americans without U.S. consent. The legislation's extraordinary provision authorizing military force against international court demonstrated how thoroughly U.S. rejected international accountability. The stated willingness to invade allied country hosting international court, rather than allow Americans to face international justice, was unprecedented assertion of national sovereignty over international law. The practical effect was to signal to IC and its member states that attempting to prosecute Americans would be treated as hostile act justifying military response, and to establish legal framework for refusing cooperation with court. No Americans have been delivered to IC custody requiring the act's use, partly because the act's existence deters cooperation, and partly because U.S. conducts operations in ways that make capturing Americans for delivery to court extremely difficult. The precedent established was that international justice mechanisms would be opposed through legislation threatening force, that international law would be subordinated to national sovereignty when applied to Americans, and that accountability would only be accepted through domestic mechanisms. Under U.S. control, destruction of interrogation videotapes demonstrated how evidence could be eliminated to prevent accountability. In November 2005, CIA Director of Operations Jose Rodriguez ordered destruction of 92 videotapes documenting interrogation sessions at CIA Black Site, including waterboarding sessions and other enhanced interrogation techniques applied to detainees. And the tapes were destroyed despite pending legal proceedings where they might be relevant evidence, and despite objections from White House counsel and other officials who warned that destruction could constitute obstruction of justice. Rodriguez's decision, documented in his later memoir and in investigative reports, was framed as protecting CIA personnel from identification and potential retaliation, but the timing and circumstances suggested the tapes documented interrogations so brutal that their continued existence posed legal risks. The tapes had been created to document interrogation sessions for quality control and legal protection. If techniques were challenged later, tapes could supposedly show that approved procedures were followed, but Rodriguez concluded that the tapes had become liability rather than protection. Internal CIA communications about the tapes, preserved in documents examined by investigators, showed ongoing debate about whether to destroy them, with lawyers warning that destruction could be illegal and that the tapes might be subject to preservation requirements under pending litigation, but Rodriguez ordered destruction anyway. Justice Department investigation into whether destruction constituted obstruction of justice concluded that while destruction was questionable, prosecutors couldn't prove criminal intent required for obstruction charges, and no charges were filed against Rodriguez or others involved. The precedent was that evidence of potential crimes could be destroyed, that officials could make unilateral decisions to eliminate documentation despite objections from lawyers, and that even when destruction appeared to be obstruction, prosecution could be avoided if criminal intent couldn't be conclusively proven. The destroyed tapes potentially documented the most brutal interrogation sessions and might have shown interrogators exceeding authorized techniques or detainees being seriously harmed, but their destruction ensured these questions would never be definitively answered. Rodriguez faced no professional consequences and defended his decision publicly, arguing that protecting CIA personnel justified destruction, and that the tapes documented authorized techniques anyway, so nothing was lost. Classifying torture program details kept the full truth from public despite Senate investigation. In December 2014, The Senate Intelligence Committee released executive summary of its 6,700-page report on CIA interrogation program, but the full report remained classified with executive privilege invoked to prevent complete disclosure, ensuring that most detailed findings about torture program's operation, effectiveness, and oversight would remain secret. The summary's release was itself controversial, with CIA and executive branch officials arguing against even limited disclosure. But Senate committee insisted that some accountability required public record of program's problems. The released summary documented that CIA had systematically misled Congress about program's effectiveness, that interrogations were more brutal than admitted, that detainees were subjected to techniques beyond what was authorized, and that claims about intelligence gained through enhanced interrogation were exaggerated or false. However, the full report, containing far more detailed documentation and specific cases, remained classified, with committee unable to force full declassification over executive branch objections. The classification meant that committee members could read full report but couldn't publicly discuss classified findings, that detailed documentation supporting summary's conclusions wasn't available for public evaluation, and that specific details about which techniques were used on which detainees and what resulted remained secret. Years later, the full report remains classified, with periodic efforts to declassify it blocked by intelligence agencies, arguing that release would harm national security. The practical effect of classification is to prevent complete accountability. Public knows torture occurred and was more extensive than admitted, but specific details that might support criminal prosecutions or create political pressure for accountability remain secret, and the mechanics of how program was authorized and implemented at granular level remain obscured. The precedent was that even when major investigations document governmental misconduct, classification can prevent full truth from emerging, executive privilege can be invoked to protect detailed findings, and partial disclosure can substitute for complete accountability. The Senate committee's efforts to investigate torture program were substantial, but classification ensured the most damaging findings remained secret, preventing the public understanding necessary for demanding meaningful accountability. Retroactive legal immunity granted through legislation ensured interrogators and officials wouldn't face prosecution for past actions. In October 2006, Congress passed the Military Commissions Act, which President Bush signed into law, and the legislation included provisions granting retroactive immunity for potential violations of Geneva Conventions through redefinition of war crimes under U.S. law, specifically exempting interrogation techniques used in CIA program from criminal liability under War Crimes Act. The legislation was drafted explicitly to address legal exposure created by Supreme Court's Hamdan v. Rumsfeld decision, which had ruled that Geneva Conventions applied to war on terror detainees, and that military commissions as structured violated Geneva protections. By redefining which violations of Geneva Conventions constituted war crimes under U.S. law and making definitions narrower, the legislation created legal framework where techniques that might have been prosecutable before were no longer crimes. And by making this retroactive, it protected interrogators and officials who had authorized techniques from prosecution for past actions. The mechanism was straightforward. War Crimes Act criminalized violations of Geneva Conventions. Geneva Conventions prohibited torture and cruel treatment. Interrogation program had used techniques that could be considered violations, so Congress simply redefined war crimes to exclude those. Techniques. Legal scholars criticized the legislation as transparent attempt to avoid accountability by retroactively legalizing conduct that was illegal when performed. But supporters argued that clarifying ambiguous legal standards and protecting personnel who had acted in good faith during unprecedented circumstances was appropriate. The legislation passed with bipartisan support, though many Democrats opposed the immunity provisions, and Bush administration made clear that protecting CIA interrogators from prosecution was priority. The practical effect was to ensure that however brutal interrogation program had been, no American would face domestic prosecution for it. Interrogators had legal opinions saying techniques were legal when performed. And now they had legislation saying those techniques weren't war crimes anyway. The precedent was complete. When governmental misconduct created prosecution risks, Congress could pass legislation retroactively, legalizing the conduct. War crimes could be redefined to exclude specific actions, and accountability could be prevented through legislative means, even when conduct clearly violated international law. The machinery had achieved perfect insulation, legal opinions authorized torture, classification concealed details, investigations were limited in scope, and legislation granted immunity, creating multiple layers of protection, ensuring no accountability despite systematic war crimes. Apologies without prosecutions offered demonstrated how symbolic gestures could substitute for accountability. Across multiple incidents spanning decades, U.S. officials issued formal apologies for civilian casualties and wrongful actions without accompanying criminal prosecutions, with statements expressing regret for errors while maintaining that personnel involved had acted within rules and procedures. President Obama apologized for the Kunduz hospital attack while military investigation concluded no criminal charges were warranted. President Clinton apologized for radiation experiments while no researchers faced prosecution, and various administrations expressed regret for drone strikes killing civilians while maintaining that targeting decisions followed proper authorization. The pattern showed that apologies served diplomatic and political functions, acknowledging harm, expressing regret, sometimes offering compensation, but didn't translate into accountability through criminal justice system. Officials could apologize for outcomes while defending processes that produced those outcomes, acknowledging that people died wrongly while maintaining that those responsible for their deaths hadn't committed crimes. The framework separated individual responsibility from institutional regret, allowing organizations to express sorrow while protecting personnel, and it demonstrated that admitting mistakes didn't require punishing those who made them if mistakes occurred while following approved procedures. The precedent was that symbolic accountability through apologies could substitute for meaningful accountability through prosecution, that expressing regret was sufficient institutional response even when actions caused massive harm, and that accountability meant acknowledging errors rather than punishing those responsible. Apologies without prosecutions offered demonstrated how symbolic gestures could substitute for accountability. Across multiple incidents spanning decades, U.S. officials issued formal apologies for civilian casualties and wrongful actions without accompanying criminal prosecutions, with statements expressing regret for errors while maintaining that personnel involved had acted within rules and procedures. President Obama apologized for the Kunduz hospital attack while military investigation concluded no criminal charges were warranted. President Clinton apologized for radiation experiments while no researchers faced prosecution, and various administrations expressed regret for drone strikes killing civilians while maintaining that targeting decisions followed proper authorization. The pattern showed that apologies served diplomatic and political functions, acknowledging harm, expressing regret, sometimes offering compensation, but didn't translate into accountability through criminal justice system. Officials could apologize for outcomes while defending processes that produced those outcomes, acknowledging that people died wrongly while maintaining that those responsible for their deaths hadn't committed crimes. The framework separated individual responsibility from institutional regret, allowing organizations to express sorrow while protecting personnel, and it demonstrated that admitting mistakes didn't require punishing those who made them if mistakes occurred while following approved procedures. The precedent was that symbolic accountability through apologies could substitute for meaningful accountability through prosecution, that expressing regret was sufficient institutional response even when actions caused massive harm, and that accountability meant acknowledging errors rather than punishing those responsible. Compensation paid to silence victims became routine administrative procedure for managing civilian casualty incidents. Across conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, U.S. military established condolence payment programs, providing cash to families of civilians killed or injured in operations, with payments typically ranging from several thousand to tens of thousands of dollars depending on circumstances, and payment often conditioned on recipients signing agreements not to pursue further legal action. The programs were framed as expressing regret and providing support to families harmed by operations, but practical effect was to resolve incidents through cash settlements that prevented litigation and public accountability. Condolence payments were administrative rather than legal admissions of wrongdoing. Military could pay families while maintaining that operations were lawful, and the amounts were standardized rather than calculated based on actual damages, treating deaths as administrative costs rather than legal. Liabilities. Documentation of condolence payment programs, examined through military records and investigative reporting, showed systematic processing of claims with payments made for incidents across the spectrum, from clear accidents to questionable targeting decisions, and the uniformity of process treated. Very different types of incidents similarly. Families receiving payments typically signed releases preventing further claims, effectively trading legal rights for immediate cash, and in many cases, families accepted payments not because amounts were adequate, but because alternatives, pursuing claims through foreign legal systems or international mechanisms were impractical. The precedent established was that civilian casualties could be resolved through standardized cash payments, that financial compensation could substitute for legal accountability, and that systematic civilian harm could be managed through administrative mechanisms that prevented individual incidents from generating broader accountability pressure. Whistleblowers face prosecution instead of those whose misconduct was exposed, inverting accountability to punish disclosure rather than wrongdoing. Chelsea Manning received a 35-year sentence for providing classified documents to WikiLeaks that exposed war crimes and civilian casualties, serving 7 years before sentence was commuted, while personnel whose actions were documented in leaked materials faced no charges. Daniel Hale received a 45-month sentence for leaking documents about drone programs' civilian casualties, providing public documentation of signature strikes' actual effects and civilian death rates, while drone operators and officials who authorized strikes continued operations without accountability. Edward Snowden faced Espionage Act charges and remains in exile for exposing mass surveillance programs that courts later ruled illegal, while officials who implemented surveillance faced no prosecution. The pattern showed systematic inversion, where exposing misconduct carried harsher consequences than committing it, where classification was used to conceal wrongdoing, and violating classification became the prosecutable offense regardless of public interest in disclosed information. Prosecutions under Espionage Act, originally designed to punish spying for foreign powers, were increasingly used against whistleblowers, providing information to journalists and public. And legal framework prevented defendants from arguing that disclosures served public interest by exposing illegality. The precedent was complete. Classification could shield misconduct from accountability. Whistleblowers revealing misconduct would face prosecution under Espionage Act with sentences measured in decades. And system protected itself by making disclosure more dangerous than the misconduct disclosed, ensuring that future potential whistleblowers would face calculus where exposing wrongdoing meant personal destruction while wrongdoing itself remained protected. Techniques migrate to new conflicts as institutional knowledge preserved methods across generations despite official discontinuation of programs. Interrogation techniques developed through MKUltra in 1950s and 60s reappeared in CIA's enhanced interrogation program after 9/11, with stress positions, sensory deprivation, and psychological exploitation showing remarkable continuity across decades despite official claims that earlier programs had been discontinued and condemned. The techniques weren't transmitted through preserved official documents, those had been destroyed. But through institutional culture, training that passed through generations of intelligence personnel, and consulting relationships with psychologists and researchers who maintain knowledge of methods. Similarly, counterinsurgency tactics developed in Philippines, refined in Vietnam, and applied in Central America appeared again in Iraq and Afghanistan, with patterns of population control, intelligence gathering through coercion, and acceptance of civilian casualties as operational necessities. Showing consistency across conflicts separated by decades. The documentation showed that lessons learned from controversial operations weren't that techniques were wrong, but that implementation needed refinement and that public exposure needed prevention. Creating institutional knowledge focused on operational effectiveness and plausible deniability, rather than legal and ethical constraints. Training materials, operational guidance, and consulting arrangements preserved tactical knowledge even when official programs ended, and personnel who had implemented techniques in earlier conflicts became trainers and advisors in later ones. The precedent was that controversial techniques became institutional knowledge that persisted independent of official policy, that discontinuing programs didn't eliminate methods if knowledge was preserved informally, and that each new conflict provided opportunity to apply refined versions of techniques that had been officially condemned in previous contexts. Legal frameworks remain unchanged despite exposures and investigations documenting systematic problems. War powers authorities granting presidents broad discretion to use military force, detention policies allowing indefinite holding of terrorism suspects, and targeted killing programs operating under classified legal memoranda continued largely unchanged despite investigations revealing abuses and despite periodic reform efforts. The authorization for use of military force passed after 9/11 remained operative decades later as legal foundation for operations across multiple countries, interpreted broadly to justify strikes and operations far beyond original context. Executive detention authorities established for Guantanamo and other facilities remained available despite documented abuses and despite most detainees being released, with legal frameworks allowing detention without trial based on enemy combatant status remaining intact. Targeted killing programs, authorized through classified Justice Department memoranda providing legal justification for killing American citizens abroad and establishing criteria for signature strikes, continued operating under same basic legal frameworks despite documentation of civilian casualties and despite concerns about extrajudicial killing. Congressional oversight remained limited by classification that prevented detailed examination of operations, by executive privilege protecting internal deliberations, and by both parties' general acceptance that broad authorities were necessary for counterterrorism. Periodic reform efforts, restricting interrogation techniques, increasing transparency requirements, narrowing detention authorities, produced modest changes at margins but left fundamental frameworks intact. The precedent was that even substantial documented abuses didn't generate political pressure sufficient to fundamentally alter legal authorities, that frameworks enabling misconduct remained available even when specific abuses were addressed, and that institutional resistance to oversight combined with security justifications to preserve broad authorities despite their demonstrated potential for abuse. Next generation trained in same doctrine, ensuring continuity of approaches that generated documented war crimes and civilian casualties. Military education at staff colleges and academies taught lessons from recent conflicts that emphasized operational effectiveness, with case studies of Iraq and Afghanistan focusing on tactics and strategies rather than legal and ethical failures. Rules of engagement were refined based on operational experience, with changes typically expanding rather than restricting authorities and providing more flexibility to commanders. Civilian casualty mitigation procedures were implemented in response to specific incidents, but underlying targeting authorities and operational approaches remained consistent, treating civilian deaths as tragic but acceptable costs of operations, rather than as indicators that approaches needed. Fundamental revision. Officer education included instruction on law of armed conflict, but practical emphasis and training and operational culture remained on mission accomplishment with legal compliance treated as constraint to be managed rather than as core operational requirement. The institutional culture transmitted through military education and operational mentoring emphasized that civilian casualties, while regrettable, were inevitable in modern warfare, and that commanders couldn't be paralyzed by fear of collateral damage. Lessons learned from controversial operations focused on tactical refinements, better intelligence, more precise weapons, faster damage assessment. Rather than questioning whether operations generating systematic civilian casualties should be conducted differently or not at all. The cycle continued. New generation of officers learned from previous generations' experience. Institutional knowledge emphasized what worked tactically while treating legal and ethical problems as implementation issues, and fundamental approaches that had generated documented war crimes remained. Embedded in doctrine and culture, the machinery perpetuated itself, with each generation inheriting frameworks and authorities that enabled the same patterns that had produced decades of documented civilian harm.